All right, we are live. Miss Sitnick, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the show.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I feel like I'm back in my teaching days being called Miss Sitnick. Jill is absolutely fine, don't you worry.
Okay, I'm trying to keep it a little professional to get started. You know what I mean? Now, when I
Absolutely.
told my sister, I told her I was going to be interviewing somebody about their experience with MDMA, and she was like, "Molly, is that what you're talking about?" And I imagine that's what most of us think of when we hear MDMA, Molly, ecstasy, the party drug. But it was when I came across you and your videos that I was really surprised to learn that it can also be used medicinally to treat like a number of mental disorders.
Sure. That's absolutely the very first thing I get. Wait a minute, you got high to heal trauma? What? So yeah, her reaction is exactly what I get all the time.
Yeah, so for you specifically, the use of MDMA was to treat PTSD.
Yes.
Now, before we get into that, I'm very curious to know what exactly caused that PTSD. Because when most of us hear it, at least me, I'm thinking people that have seen war, they were involved in some kind of combat, some very traumatic experiences. That's what I imagine most of us think of when we hear PTSD. But I also know that's not your case.
Right. And you know what? And that is pretty much what we hear about. I am getting over a cold, so if I suddenly have to grab some tea, bear with me there.
No
Um,
worries.
but my PTSD came in my late 40s, surprised me above all other people. I actually argued with my therapist when she gave me that diagnosis. And basically, what PTSD is unresolved trauma, unresolved emotions. And many of us go through life just kind of paving over some of those early childhood memories and just kind of pushing through life. My personality became high anxiety, high work ethic, always being super, super conscious to stay safe, but never really understanding that it birthed from trauma. And, you know, in my late 40s, my partner of over 20 years passed away. And about 18 months after he passed away, I got this very basic email from work that just spiraled my nervous system. It represented to me that my life was going to fall apart, all the safety that I had created was going to go away. And I didn't have my partner to help me regulate my nervous system. And so PTSD in an adult coming from childhood trauma evidences itself very often as a hypervigilance, a need to stay safe, people pleasing. And in your body, you can feel it in a variety of ways. For me, it was, you know, my shoulders up to my ears, my back was tight. In that specific time of my life, in that PTSD spiral, I wasn't sleeping well, I wasn't eating well, my brain was a little foggy. It was tough to live. That's why I pursued the treatment. It was tough to live with it. So PTSD from child abuse or from a physical attack or from really anything that the body hasn't released the emotion from is absolutely possible.
Wow. But so in your specific case, going back to childhood, what are some of those things that you think led to the eventual PTSD spiral that you mentioned? What happened?
So I came from no. So first of all, I'm Generation X. So if you had asked me before my treatment what kind of childhood I had, I just would have been like, it was crappy, and then I would have changed the subject because my father was a domestic abuser, mentally and physically. My mother was clinically depressed her entire life and routinely attempted suicide. When I was 5, she tried to commit suicide via a shotgun, and she actually survived. And then the rest of my childhood was very much a myriad of moving among houses, among relatives. Sometimes there was housing insecurity, sometimes there was food insecurity. There was being thrown out of my mother's house, being thrown out of my father's house, I should say apartments. And it was a childhood with a foundation of a lack of stability, which produced as an adult someone hyper fixated on security, making sure the rug couldn't be taken out from under me. And there was also just a constant fear. My father was at the very basic level a bully. He really loved to kind of beat you down. There was never a nice word to say. Slapping you was kind of routine. You never knew when it was going to come. And, you know, it just, I had this borderline terror of my father my entire life that I didn't even start to touch until I went into this therapy.
That's heavy, man. It's very
Sorry,
heavy.
you asked.
No, I want to know. I want to know all of it. Please, just at any time, let me know if we're going too far. But I'm very curious because
I don't know.
it's a very, I don't even know if I can say unique. I'm sure a lot of people are dealing with traumatic experiences that they don't talk about and that never see the light of day. But you specifically, I mean, you mentioned some pretty heavy stuff. I mean, you're saying that your father was mentally and physically abusive. He's slapping you around, he's bullying you, and things like that. Now, was that just with you? Was that with everybody in the house, everybody in his life?
That's a fantastic question. So when I was young, I'm an only child. It was just me and my mother. And my father really enjoyed or seemed to get some sort of enjoyment out of beating and bullying and really actively targeting women. I never saw his behavior or that behavior with a man. So he knew the limits. And when you started to stand up to him, it either got worse if he thought that he could kind of beat you down, or he would retreat. So there was a narcissism there. When people read my memoir, they're like, "Do you know your dad was a psychopath?" I'm like, "No, I just knew he was a jerk." You know, um, he's passed at this point, so luckily he's not impacting anybody else's life. But abusers know the people that they can abuse pretty well, which is why a lot of times women aren't believed, because from domestic abusers, the men who investigate don't see the behavior from the domestic abusers because they show it to the women. And that's my opinion, everybody. Don't get all up in the comments. That's
No, I mean, it sounds like classic bully behavior, though. I mean, you said it perfectly, which is they know exactly who to target and who not to mess with. And so, what's your earliest memory of this behavior starting? I mean, how old were you when you first started getting abused by your father?
what's interesting is that there is a brutal memory. I know I was a toddler. I know it was before my mother shot herself. So I'm going to guess it's around 3 or 4. I really don't know. But the memory that I actually, years in my 20s, I had an EMDR session to deal with this memory. It was me standing at the top of the stairs. My mother and father were arguing. My father was downstairs. My mother was upstairs. And I planted myself at the top of the stairs. I was going to protect my mommy. Excuse me, folks. And I remember my father was 6'2", 230 pounds. And I remember my father charging up the stairs. And when he got to the top of the stairs, he grabbed my leg, dragged me down the stairs, and threw me across the room. So my head hurt. My head hit the wall on the other side. And I remember huddling as my mother was getting beaten upstairs. And that memory in one of my MDMA sessions came up because I had had this internal feeling my entire life that I was fundamentally a very mean person, that I had to hide from people, that I was a mean person. If only they got to know me, they would know I was a mean person. And you know where that came from? It came from that little toddler huddling for her own survival downstairs and hurting while her mother was getting beaten, because
Wow.
what that little girl said to herself is, "What an awful person you are that you aren't going to go help your mother. You couldn't help your mother. And you're hiding down here." Like, that's what that little girl, not in that language, I'm obviously using adult language, but that's what that little girl internalized. And I sound like I'm crying. I'm so sorry. I'm still getting over this cold. But that's one of the early memories of the heightened abuse. And that's not the getting slapped around, getting locked outside when there's a storm. Like, that's none of that stuff. That's like the first time I actively remember a really strong physical attack.
So interesting. Well, really quick, you said EMDR session. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So when I was in my 20s, I was lucky enough to have a fantastic friend who was going through who was going through a therapist program. And she said, "Hey, there's this EMDR thing where basically uh, uh, I'm going to," and by the way, this is a level 100 explanation. I'm not an
Sure, sure.
expert. But what she did was she had me follow her finger and the rhythmic motion in some way, shape, or form It didn't get rid of that memory. It took the fear out of that memory of my father coming up the stairs, because even in my 20s, I was still having nightmares about it. And that EMDR session helped me not no longer fear that actual, like, it stopped the nightmares. I don't know how it did it. It didn't deal with the rest of the trauma that was so deeply, deeply hidden. I didn't even know that there was deep trauma at that time. I didn't understand trauma. I was just super thankful that the EMDR took the fear away from that particular memory.
So it's some kind of therapy, is that right? Some type of methodology for helping you process memories?
For trauma, like if you have EMDR, and I'm sorry, I don't know what it stands for, but for people who have, like, they suddenly, like, they have a solid life, solid things going on throughout their whole life, but then something really traumatic happens, a car accident or attack or something of that sort. EMDR therapy can be super helpful for some folks.
I'm looking here. It says eye movement desensitization and reprocessing,
Awesome.
psychotherapy treatment that is designed to alleviate the distress associated with traumatic memories.
Yeah, there you go.
But it's very interesting to hear the way you reacted, especially we're talking 3 or 4 years old. Obviously, you didn't think what you just expressed in those words. But when I think about situations like that, I mean, we're all different and we all react to situations in the same way. And what I would imagine is a feeling of helplessness. But what I'm hearing from you is even if you did feel that, the main feeling or reaction to that situation was, I'm a bad person because I'm not up there helping somebody else.
When we are here's what I've learned through years of therapy, is that when we are little, and this is universal, we are the center of our own universes. We are the sun. And so anything that happens has to be because of us. A toddler cannot comprehend that its caregiver is dangerous, because then what does a toddler do? It can't get away. So there, it's kind of like human programming, that it's all about me. And so instead of me as a toddler saying, my father is really damaged, he's the one who's bad here, I'm fine, I'm just trying to survive. The toddler voice is, there is something wrong with me. Look at me. I'm not even trying to help anymore because I got hurt. And those feelings of I'm not enough, I'm a mean person, they followed me. And my therapist likes to use the line that we are all children wrapped up in adult layers, because usually when you start to talk to somebody, you will eventually get to some form of I'm not good enough or I'm too much. And it all stems from when we were little kids. And MDMA therapy lets you take those memories from toddler age to late 40s, look at those memories and go, hey, wait a minute. It wasn't that I was a mean person. I was trying to survive. He
Yeah.
could have killed me. So you get to change the perspective. I mean, if you really think about how much of our decisions and our lives are based on opinions of ourselves that were created when we are toddlers, I think a lot of people should be getting psychedelic assisted psychotherapy to change some of those opinions.
100%. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to even imagine what that type of, because you're talking about regular abuse. We're not just talking about one event. That was just the first one you remember. But it sounds like throughout your whole life, this was a reoccurring theme just with your dad. Then on your mother's side, you said she was clinically depressed and routinely tried to take her own life. And your earliest memory of this is at 5 years old and she's trying to take her own life with the shotgun and survive. Now, was this something that you saw with your own eyes, or how did this go down?
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but my mother had already tried to slit her wrist. She had already tried to OD on drugs. She, her arms were kind of a lesson in how not to kill yourself, because I learned that, slanting a certain way doesn't really do it, but whatever. Um, my father and I had come home from somewhere, and I ran upstairs to go see mommy. And mommy was laid out in the master bedroom's bathroom. And, memories are kind. All I really remember is her on the floor and kind of like red on her belly. What I remember much more is, so it's almost like things stop. Like I don't have a memory past seeing that, but the next memory is I am somehow at the neighbor's house looking, I'm at the door of the neighbor's house watching my mother being put into an ambulance. And that feeling of I'm alone, that feeling of like, you're at a party and maybe your parents ran late and like the parents are already cleaning up the party and you're the only kid that's left and you really don't belong. That was that feeling on steroids. That's what I remember most from that. Like I didn't have a home anymore.
Do you remember how your dad reacted to the situation?
I don't.
Mm.
I pretty much went blank.
Now, I was watching some of your videos on your YouTube channel, and you just mentioned your neighbor. Is this the same neighbor that solicited something from you at what I think it was like 12, 6 or 12 years old or something like that?
Oh no, 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 no. Luckily
Different
not. No,
neighbor.
wait, yeah, yeah. Probably about 7 or 8 different places I've lived since that time was that neighbor. Yeah, I moved around a lot as a kid.
So, like, help me understand because this is happening at a very young age, and you said that you were going from your mom's apartment to your dad's apartment to other people's apartments. So, at what point did you leave the initial place that you knew as home, and where did you go?
Um, so look at me, I have to think about it.
Mm,
So like age 1 to 5 was mom and dad. And then when mom shot herself, she survived, but just imagine the recuperation. And this was 1975. And my thinking is that that triggered, like at some point, she was able to start getting a divorce. I think the laws had changed that people could actually have, women could have their own bank accounts and credit cards and stuff like that. And so I know that after age 5, we never lived as a 3-person family again. So my mother was recuperating. I don't know what was going on with my father. I'm guessing he had to help her. I went to go live with my grandparents, and then I went to go live with a couple of other family members. It gets really fuzzy.
mm-hmm.
I wasn't in a school for a full year until 7th grade.
Shit.
So forgive me for not kind of remembering everywhere I went. And then, 7th grade, I got, my father threw me out. I went to live with my mother. Then I was there till I was 16. My mother threw me out. Then I was there with my father, and then made it through 1 year of college. Came back home. He thought he could start beating me again, and I just left. I was done. I was done with these two people in my life. Just I was done.
What I'm trying to understand is how does somebody survive a shotgun wound that was self-inflicted? I mean,
To the belly.
to the stomach.
To the stomach. She had pellets. So she always kind of explained away her physicality by like a bad car accident, because that explained the
Mm,
arms, and that explained kind of not being able to move around. Like my mom couldn't really wear stuff around the waist, kind of thing. And even the last 2 years of her life, she was still having pellets coming to the surface. I have no idea how she survived it.
wow. Now, listening to this part of the story, I'm very curious to know a little bit more about the effect on you because as a kid, you're looking up to mom and dad as examples of who to be as a person. I mean, you're learning how to exist in this world. Those are theoretically your role models, and your mother's clinically depressed, routinely trying to take her own life. Your dad is, let's say, psychotic, for lack of a better word, beating you and your mother. And so I just have to imagine, as you said, you're not really feeling safe at any point during the day. And so it's like, especially as a young girl trying to grow up and you look at your dad as the first male figure in your life, what was the dynamic like living with him on a day to day, knowing that at any point he could just unleash on you?
Well, that really came about when I was 16. When my mother threw me out, my father had kind of disrupted my life greatly. Like things were okay with me and my mother. There wasn't money or anything, and he kind of came back into my life, and I was young, and He was throwing around money that he didn't have, and he was nice. And I was 16. I wanted a father in my life. And that wound up being catastrophic because when my mother could not handle her justified fear of my father. And I almost wish she would have kind of talked about it with me because back then it was like you have to kind of respect that someone's your father and your mother. Like there really was not this acceptance of just like no, cut it off kind of thing because that would have been the best thing to just cut him off. But I went to go live with him when I was 16 in a one-bedroom apartment that never became two bedrooms. He was a bit of a hoarder. He always had a hard time staying employed. After his passing, I looked at his social security records. I don't know how the man made money. And I absolutely felt like a target. My half a junior, full senior year, I looked as sloppy as I could possibly look. I didn't try to draw attention. He would sometimes show up in the morning in my bed. I don't believe anything happened. I don't think I have any repressed memories. I was enough of a person at 16 to know, this is wrong. There's something wrong with him. I codependently completely adjusted my behavior around him to do the very best I could so that I wouldn't get slapped around. He got a little bit more afraid of me. I think as I got older, I was harder to beat up. I'm 5'7". um, but it still could come out of nowhere. And what he liked to do was just kind of randomly show up at places, at work, at school, after school activity. He would just like randomly show up to check on me. And if I wasn't where I was supposed to be, it would be like, typical domestic abuser stuff. But I learned, and I'm not exactly sure how, I don't know how. I think children sometimes make a decision when they're very young. Are they going to be like their parents or are they not going to be like their parents? And again, it's my opinion. I knew at a very, very young age that these two people were living life wrong. like it didn't have to be, I didn't know what it could be. I just knew it didn't have to be like this.
Yeah.
And so, trust me, a lot of therapy, a lot of wonderful people in my life helping me along the way. But I knew at a very early age that I didn't want to live my life the way that they were living their lives.
What do you think? I mean, all those years of watching the way your father treated your mother and also the way she treated herself, how do you think that shaped your view of who your mother is as a person?
Um, my mother, you asking some really interesting questions. How did that affect my the initial thing that a child will do is gravitate to the adult that's less abusive, number 1. Number 2, my mother always appeared weak, and I apparently have always had a little bit of a streak in me of kind of like, let's go. And so there was a bit of trying to protect my mother, trying to be the parent. I mean, when I was, I think, 15, I had to call some family members to get my mom institutionalized. Like a lot of times, I was the adult in
Shit.
the relationship, kind of thing. So, and the only reason I had to call an adult was that I was only 15. I couldn't institutionalize her myself, kind of thing. So I think that's what it became. And then as I got older, I just recognized the intense neediness that my mother had. She basically didn't get love from her parents. And so my mother went her entire life at this intense neediness. And it has given me an incredible radar when I'm working with folks that I can just kind of like, I can pick it up really fast when somebody's relatively needy because they kind of lacked getting something earlier in their lives. It's both kind
Mm.
of a ding, 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 that's like your mother. And then it's also oh, they didn't get something that they needed and they're constantly searching for it through that behavior. I hope that answered your question because I've never had that question before.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course, of course. Because when I try to put myself in your shoes and I'm thinking, man, what it must be like to have to watch something like that, I would have to imagine some people would feel pity for this woman. Other people might lose respect and say, like, why do you continue to take this shit? Why don't you just leave? And we all react to these situations differently. And I guess another thing that you said was really interesting is that she probably didn't get something that she needed from her parents, which caused her to be needy and at some point dependent on somebody else. So even if she knows I'm in this shitty situation. I'm being beaten. I want to end my own life. I don't really know where else to go. So I'm just going to stay here because the devil I know is much better than the devil I don't know. So it's just easier to stay in this place.
Um, so what's interesting about that is that I take for granted that I have my own bank account, I have my own credit cards. One of the things that I worked on in the therapy was, why did my mom want to abandon me? Like, I knew for a fact there was enough early therapy in my life at some point that I knew that my mother attempting suicide was not my fault. Like, some therapist somewhere along the line did a great job with that. What we didn't touch on was that I was very angry at my mother for trying to abandon me and leaving me with my father. Why would she do that? And it wasn't until I think it was my second journey that I had a memory of my mother and I going to like Kmart. I don't know if you have Kmart where you are, but it was like a discount store.
Hmm.
My mother got an entire cart of stuff because she was trying to leave my father. And we got to the register and the credit card got declined. He had figured out she was trying to leave. And she was crying. Now, I didn't have enough. All I knew was that the shoes that we picked out, I wasn't getting. But to her, that credit card getting declined, she didn't, her parents weren't alive. She didn't have a bank account. She didn't have her own credit card. Where was she going to go? And this is 1975. And when I suddenly realized my mother's suicides were not abandoning me, they were desperation to escape my father, because the abuse my father was giving me was, 20-30% of what he was giving her.
Mm.
So it's a really interesting, I think my generation, generations past me, kind of take for granted the amount of freedom that women have had to fight for. My mother didn't have a choice.
That's very interesting to learn because I had no idea that in 75 women couldn't have their own bank accounts or credit cards. So it's not like, based on what you said, it's not even necessarily I don't really know, or like it's not that I don't want to leave, it's that I literally can't even if I go
Really?
somewhere. How am I going to support myself? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's wild, man.
Yeah.
That's wild. Um, Oh boy, and I think one another thing that's very mature that you said was that whether it was because of therapy or not, I don't know, but you said that you realized at some point it wasn't her trying to abandon you, it was her just trying to get out of
Escape.
a situation that really had no other exit strategy. There was really nothing else to do. And I think that's gotta be a very tough position to be in as a parent because you know you have this child or children to take care of, and at the same time, you can't even find a reason to get out of bed in the morning, which seems contradictory
Yeah.
because it's like, well, I need to take care of my kids, they're my whole world, but how am I supposed to take care of them when I can't even take care of myself?
And I think you have to remember too just how awful my father was. And when I say you just have to remember, here's why I say this. After my first journey, so like my first therapeutic journey, I'm walking my dog, which was a lot of my integration, a lot of these memories coming up and me reshaping them. That's what integration is. You're kind of like you're looking at your old memories, you're reframing them, and you're kind of deciding to live life a little differently. I was walking the dog and I'm walking and I'm like, my mother was not a hunter. It was not my mother's gun. Heck, she wasn't even good enough to actually kill herself with a shotgun. And I'm walking and I remembered, in addition to like, okay, my mother wasn't a hunter. There was a conversation my mother and I had about my father keeping his loaded shotgun in the bedroom. So if you have a person in your life who has already tried suicide, would it be a logical thing to do to keep a loaded shotgun in the bedroom?
Of course
Which
not.
is which is what tells me my mother was egged on. This was probably an idea she had, and I think it was definitely reinforced by my father. Yeah, I think he wanted
Jesus
her gone.
Christ.
And so when you look at it, you look at I couldn't start to see all of these puzzle pieces before the therapy. Before the therapy, it was kind of angry she tried to abandon me. After the therapy, it was like, wait a minute, I can put all these pieces together and see a completely different reality from an adult perspective. And I can understand her choices now.
But and I at 16, you don't understand much of anything. I mean, just normal life, if we can call it that. So, I mean, you're talking about dealing with some very heavy stuff, going to school at the same time. So, how are you behaving and interfacing with other people at school? Because if you're not safe at home and it's nothing but chaos, were you able to put on some kind of mask at school to where nobody knew what was going on? I mean, what was your day to day like at 16 to 18?
Well, 16 to 18, living with my father was a complete focus on school and work. Stay out of the apartment as much as possible. Do school, extracurriculars, and a job. And plus, there wasn't really money, so there was always that motivation. And I'm very lucky. I've always been relatively bright. School was pretty easy for me. So, in a lot of ways, school was an escape. I would get my positive reinforcement from teachers, to be candid, because I certainly wasn't
Mm-hmm.
getting it at home. And and it had been drilled into me. The one thing my parents did well is that they drilled into me, you're going to college, you're going to college, you're going. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything. I just knew it. I was going to go to college. And I think that really kept me focused that year and a half of just get through this year and a half, just stay safe, just stay out of his way as much as possible, do what you need to do to get out of this. At the time, the only thing I could figure out how to get out of it was an education, and so that's where my focus was.
You said earlier that one thing that motivated you to move in with your dad at 16 was, I mean, you wanted a father like every kid. They want to be with their parents. But what was it
I didn't have a
exactly?
choice. No, my mother threw me.
Oh, oh,
Yeah, no,
she
I
threw
didn't have
you
a choice.
out.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I
No, there was no
misheard
choice
you.
there. No.
Jesus. But I don't remember if you said this already. What was her rationale behind that? Why'd she decide to throw you out at that point?
Well, again, this therapy has helped tremendously with the memories. And at the time, I could not figure out why my mother was just flipping out so much that my father was around. As a child, again, I got like 20 to 30% of the abuse. She got a whole lot that I'm not even aware of, right? I certainly didn't figure out at 16 that my father had left a loaded shotgun for her available. I didn't know that stuff. Um, I still remember the look on my mother's face when she slapped me and threw me out. And it was terror. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't anger. It was terror. She just knew my father kept showing up. He was around and he was a bit of a stalker. So he would just show up at random times. This wasn't somebody who would be polite and call and say, "Hey, I'd like to pick Jill up at like 9 o'clock on a Saturday. Does that work?" No, he would just like randomly show up at like 7 a.m., you know? And her terror of him, it just basically meant getting rid of me. That was the sacrifice for her own mental
Jesus.
health. People, it has always been super helpful as soon as I understood that people are not necessarily against you, they are for themselves. And when you look at that situation, my mother's terror of my father, it overrode everything else. I really can't blame her. And I was 16. I was a smart ass. I was very smart. I was a smart ass.
That's a really hard thing to accept, though, because I mean, I have to imagine there's a lot of people that have never gone to therapy, even if they know something's wrong, and they're walking around with these, if we can call them childlike perspectives on what happened to them when they were younger, and just walking around just mad at their parents or their brothers or whoever it was that hurt them.
Yeah.
And they really do, as you said, we have this self-centered way of thinking about life, and everything's being done to me. Everybody's trying to treat me wrong. Everybody has a problem with me when everybody's got their own shit going on. And especially back then, I mean, I think about my parents, I think about my siblings with children. Most people, regardless of whether they have kids or not, are just not great communicators to begin with. So even if they have a problem, trying to communicate to you what's actually going on in a way that you can understand, for a lot of people feels impossible, you know?
It can be. Sure. Sure.
Yeah. Mm. And another thing that's interesting about trauma in general is I think a common misconception about traumatic experiences is that they make you stronger. Everybody says it's a rough childhood, it's going through the pain, that you learn from those lessons, they give you thick skin and stuff like that. But I don't think that's the case for everybody. For a lot of people, it makes them even more sensitive. It makes them weaker. It makes them insecure. It makes them get overwhelmed extremely easily. So, what do you think it was about you that actually turned on? I don't even know what I would call it. Let's say it lit a fire inside of you and made you go harder as opposed to retreating into yourself.
I don't know. At one point, my therapist asked me that too. She's like, "Jill, you really you go after this healing stuff. Like, what motivates you?" I'm like, "I don't know. It's just kind of who I guess I just get angry sometimes. Back then, especially when I started the therapy, I got angry that my father was still impacting my life. I didn't get sad about it. I got angry. I was
Mm.
like, why is he still in my head?" But your comment about, we have this image that trauma makes us stronger. For folks out there who might be familiar with IFS, internal family systems, it's a way of thinking, it's a therapeutic approach, and it's a way of thinking about the same way that we have a family dynamic in real life, is that we have different parts inside of our heads that act like a family. It's a beautiful, imaginative way of working with our mind in therapy. And so that idea you said that, tough times make us stronger, in IFS terminology, that means that we have a couple of protectors. So, what protectors will do is they will make sure that if we are in a similar situation as an adult that we found terrifying as a child, you might find you get super nervous or you start thinking, "Oh, that's a bad idea." Like, go have a beautiful career changing opportunity to go speak at a conference. But that protector will be like, "No, no, no, it's not safe to be seen. Don't get too big for your britches. It'll make you super nervous. It might even make you pass up that opportunity." So in some ways, developing those protectors is what continued to push me on, because like there was a protector that said, "I'm not going to live like my parents. I don't know what it means not to, but I'm just not going to live like them." So it would kind of propel me to make other decisions than they would have made. So it's an interesting kind of, I don't think anybody should have to go through trauma to quote unquote get stronger. I do understand how our brains react to, sometimes our brains react to trauma and create these kind of protectors in us to keep us from harm moving forward. Um, I've had some pretty strong protectors that were going to make sure I was never put in a situation that I could have the rug pulled out from under me. That's
Yeah.
the primary role of my protectors.
Yes. I mean, it's definitely clear. It's definitely clear that you seem very, I don't know if I would use the word driven by something, whatever it may be. You seem very driven, not the type to just like lay down and take whatever's given to you. And I think that's something to be admired. But you mentioned that you did only a year and a half at college and then you came back home. Why was that? What happened?
Yeah, well, yeah, I did a year. I went to Syracuse for my freshman year, learned that I don't like lake effect snow, but that's a whole other story. Yeah, no, I got back from Syracuse, and a week after being home, I was taking a summer course in like uh, geology, rocks.
Hmm.
It was to get, some silly science requirement done. And I was studying, and my father barreled into the room and started hitting me. And I remember when he left, I was just like, "I'm done. A college education is not worth this. He's going to beat me." I was 19. Like, he's going to beat me for the rest of my life. And at that point, I really did. I couldn't see beyond the next day. I was like, "I'm losing my college education, but I cannot do this. I will not become my mother. He will simply escalate," is really what was in my head. Like, this was almost like a test. How much could he do? And I just got up and left. And I think throughout my adult life, 19 through when he passed away just in 2022, I think I saw him 3 times in my adult life.
But there was no rhyme or reason for this occurring. He just walked into the room, didn't say anything, and just started swinging.
Not that I remember. I'm sure in his mind there was a reason. I don't
Jesus
remember it.
Christ. So at any point, because we're talking about since a very young age, at any point did you think to yourself, I need to take some self-defense classes. I need to get some weapons. I need to do something to defend myself or go on the offensive at any point.
No, my strategy, he made it very clear he made it, he was a big guy and he was
Hmm.
not afraid. And he did a lot of in secret too. Like it was, for a year or two there, we were living with his girlfriend and who I still and the daughter. I still consider her my stepsister. We still chat. He rarely really hit me a lot when they were around. A lot of it was when they were out of the house. So the idea of like getting a weapon, I no, it didn't even occur to me. I was so scared. What was I going to do? I was a little kid. No, my strategy was try to be as perfect and good as possible because that's the only thing I had control over, and maybe that would make him not flip out.
You never thought about calling the police or telling somebody about what was going on in the house?
I didn't have a lot of observable bruises. I had a house, I
Mm.
had food on the table, I had clothes. It was a different time. I've shared with my therapist some of the written correspondence and some of the occurrences and things of that sort, and she's like, if it was now, child services would have been called, but this was 1970s, so there really wasn't the resources just were not there. And again, I was being fed, I was being clothed, I was in school, I was clean, like the basics were being covered from the outside perspective.
Hmm. Yeah, that seems like I have to imagine it's happening with a lot of people where from the outside looking in, everything does seem good. But because these people are so, it's strange to say this, but intelligent, meaning they know how to do exactly what they want to do in the right way. Nobody would ever know that people are being abused or that there's all kinds of problems and issues going on in the house. And we're just talking about the physical thing. You're saying that no scars or bruises were showing, but you also mentioned the psychological stuff. And I'm very curious to know what that was like in those teenage years when you're living with this man and he's not only beating you, what was he doing to kind of manipulate you psychologically? Was he saying specific things or being cold with you? Like, what was that like?
It's so interesting you're talking about this because I still sometimes hear his awful voice in my head, just incredibly critical and very critical about my appearance. My father made it very clear he was paying attention to my figure and he was making opinions and voicing opinions about my breasts, my hips, my hair, and how I had to look and how I was never going to be anything and I wasn't smart. And um, he was, I mean, things you would never really think to say to someone. I mean, I think at a fundamental level, my father was really treated terribly as a child. That's my guess. Because he really wanted to make other people feel bad. Um, and I think you have to be a really damaged person to do that. Every time I look in the mirror and I see my belly, I'm going through perimenopause and, things kind of are, my body's changing, things are settling. And I hear his voice and I'm just like, oh, get out
Wow.
of my head. But it's that ingrained. Like it was, he was kind of just a really mean person. Have you ever met like just a really mean person?
I
That was,
have, yeah, and I think you said it perfectly. It's something that is very hard to do, being empathetic towards people like that and trying to put yourself in their shoes and
yes,
actually understand even if they want to be like that, they learned it from somewhere. I don't know if I
yes.
believe, it's not obvious to me at least that people are born just being mean and evil for no apparent reason. I don't know if that's the case. And so I like to think behavior like that is learned. And it's weird too because a lot of times it is people that you love. We're talking about mom and dad, siblings, grandma and grandpa, and it's like I love these people. Why the hell are they treating me like shit? Like what have I done? Especially as a kid, you're like, did I do something wrong here? And I have to imagine as you get older, you kind of like whenever you feel that feeling again, you're probably just walking around all the time thinking that you're doing something wrong, that you're being punished for something and you don't know what you're being punished for. Just walking around scared of everybody at that
You
point.
deserve it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Just mean evil people and you have really two choices. Some people might stick around and say, I can change this person, or I'm going to accept them the way they are. I'm going to love on them anyway. And then the other option would be, I'm going to get the fuck away from these people because I got one life. There's no change in this person right here, and I got to take care of myself.
Yeah. And I didn't want to live the way he was living. I mean, he
Yeah.
was relatively unemployed hoarder in a one bedroom apartment, not particularly happy. Like that was not a life I wanted to I didn't want to catch that train.
Yeah, it's just such a tragedy, for lack of a better word, isn't it? That somebody, I mean, treating their own offspring like that, somebody who's so deeply unhappy with themselves for whatever reason, they look in the mirror and they're like, fuck you, I hate you. They hate themselves, and therefore they hate everyone around them and just have to bring everybody down to their level. And it's like, is there any saving a person like that? I really don't know. I don't know. But I just, you come across people like that and it's just like, man, I got to keep my distance because there's no way this ends positively.
Right. And people need to help themselves when it comes to mental stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, that's really it's one of the toughest roads to take because you have to face all those awful feelings. I mean, my third journey, I in the book. So I wrote a memoir about like this year of healing to kind of explain what MDMA therapy is, and I couldn't figure out. My third journey was incredibly powerful. We like finally got down to that toddler, my subconscious level, and I basically included the transcripts because I couldn't figure out any other way to say it. And in the transcripts, I actually say to my doctors, I'm not good enough to love. And they're like, well, wait a minute. Could your father love you? And it took me in the medicine to be like, no, I guess he couldn't. Maybe it wasn't that I wasn't good enough to love. Maybe it was that my father didn't have that capacity. And like I needed a psychedelic. I needed two doctors working with me while I was on that psychedelic to get that deep and change that perspective. I mean, and so many of us are walking around with that fundamental I'm not good enough or I'm too much from some sort of childhood trauma.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how did that affect you in terms of relationships? Because I mean, if you're a father, at least for the majority of girls, the first example of a man they have in their lives is their father. And I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that we're all on some level looking for our parents in our partners as we grow up and become adults. And so, how does that affect your relationship when, I mean, romantically, when you're out there dating and things like that? I mean, you're afraid of the first man in your life. How are you interacting with other men in your life?
I can say that I didn't know I was afraid of other men. That's what's really interesting. I
Mm.
dated, and when Carl and I ultimately got together, he wound up regulating my nervous system. He used to say to me, "Stop throwing the baby out with the bathwater," because I would get anxious and I'd get all hyped up, and he was kind of like the yin to my yang, and much calmer and had a much different perspective. And the research is out there. So I started my career as an English teacher, like way back when the dinosaurs roamed, right? And the research is that just one person in your life who shows you a mature level of caring and kindness can radically change your outlook and how you kind of interact with folks. And I was just, super lucky. That's what my long-term relationship did with me, which was why after he passed, a year and a half after he passed, when the widow's fog kind of died down, because we were together over 20 years, that's when the PTSD hit. He wasn't
Mm.
around to kind of help me regulate my nervous system, and obviously the grief and like it was just my nervous system had had enough. So I think that's a really good question because I do think people repeat patterns, and some of us are just incredibly lucky enough to run across people who help us break those patterns.
And so, how old were you when the two of you met, and where did you meet?
I actually keep all of that relationship stuff kind of to myself because I like to
Ah,
focus
okay,
on
okay.
therapy. What I say to folks is that I hope for everyone that they have someone in their life as loving, as kind, because that relationship coming from a abusive background, that relationship really stabilized me. And if there was anybody, there was no bigger cheerleader in my life than Carl was. And so I wish that for anybody who has been through a traumatic experience or a traumatic childhood.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It really is. And I think that I don't know how it works mentally, but I would have to imagine that what you're saying rings true regardless of the person. Is it doesn't have to be a family of people, it doesn't have to be a bunch of friends. It could just be one person. And you could be 30, 40, 50 years old when you meet this person, but they can turn your life around just by showing you what real love is, showing you what it really means to be somebody's partner. And you
Yes.
look back at your life and it doesn't even seem as bad as it actually was just because you have this person here with you now. That's beautiful, man. So let's move forward to the actual therapy because it sounds like even when you were in your teenage years, maybe your early 20s, you were seeing a therapist at that time. Is that right?
No, no. Early on, after my mother shot herself,
Uh-huh.
there was definitely a few therapists throughout childhood. I can't remember their names, but there had to have, I remember going to a couple of places and it was like, it was, you are not at fault. Your mother, you didn't cause your mother to do this. So like I came out of childhood not having, that wasn't even a part of my childhood. So somebody did a great job.
Hmm.
Whatever that therapist was, that did a great job. Um, I actually didn't believe in therapy. My mother's clinical depression and constant changing of medication and ultimately self medicating really gave me a bad taste in my mouth with the whole therapy profession. When Carl passed, it was he passed in July, and it was like in I think it was August or September. Everybody takes you out to dinner. Everyone feeds you when you have somebody who passes. It's a lovely way to get somebody kind of out of the house, kind of thing. And a friend of mine saw how completely dysregulated I was and passed me my therapist's number, and I'm like, I'm not doing that. I don't believe in therapists. Like, they don't work. Da, da. And he was like, would you just trust me? Go. And the only way that I managed to get myself there was that my grief was so strong that friends can only handle so much. It's kind of grief really in the American society, grief is really not understood. And so I got to the point where I treated myself to therapy to help me with the grief. And that's actually how I met my therapist. 18 months after when I had this panic attack, and for the first time we started talking about my childhood stuff, that's when she diagnosed me with the PTSD. And she was in a program to be a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist. She's the one that introduced me to the concept of the therapy, told me about the clinical research. So I, like 1,000%, just kind of fell into a wonderful therapist helping me with grief and a wonderful therapist, same woman, helping me with PTSD with this MDMA therapy. It's kind of like the universe just works in mysterious ways.
What do you mean when you say that American society doesn't understand grief?
Oh, I think we get, it gets me angry. Bear with me. I think we get all of 5 days. Your partner from your life passes away and you get 5 days. And we don't know how to handle it. Americans like to try to talk you out of it. You're going to be okay. It's going to be all right. Like they want it to kind of speed up and end. And grief is a process and it has phases. And it doesn't just go away. I mean, heck, in March, I went to a psychedelic tourism retreat specifically to deal with kind of like some out of proportion grief I still had over Carl's death. It would have been like 7 years, and I was still kind of responding in a way that I felt like this grief is just embedded, and I needed something to kind of help me get over it. In American society, we just don't, it makes us very uncomfortable, is my experience.
And why do you think we're like that? Because I do agree. I do agree. And I never thought about it that way, but you lose a family member or something tragic happens, and it's like, I'm sorry, but we need you at work at 7 a.m. on Monday morning. Like, I don't know what you want me to say. We got products to sell or services to render or whatever it is. Do you think that it really is what a lot of us blame it on, which is just this obsession with capitalism and the dollar? Do you think it really is that, or something deeper is causing us to just overlook or disregard? the complete process that is grieving somebody's death or somebody's loss.
I absolutely think there is an element of capitalism, at least in the American society. So, I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole for a while. In addition, in my experience, Generation X did not grow up having any real understanding of what trauma really is and how it stays in the body, and how uh, the terminology empathetic witness. So two people can lose a loved one. Two people can lose a loved one, and one person might have a bunch of empathetic witnesses, people to hug her, people to be around, to bring the casserole and offer a lot of support. And that person is probably going to deal with the trauma of the grief in a much faster way. I didn't have family. So my friends rallied around me, but at some point, things get a little exhausting for friends. I needed to kind of create an extended family, quote unquote, with my therapist. Don't take that out of context, folks. There's no transference here. I'm just talking about I needed to expand my group a little bit. Um, and I think the fact that I didn't have as many empathetic witnesses, I really only processed a bit of the grief before the PTSD really hit. It kind of stayed with me, and we just don't have an understanding. A strong People of my generation don't have a strong understanding that trauma isn't just here. Trauma kind of lives in our bodies. It's a beautiful book, The Body Keeps the Score by Vanderkolt, that explains how trauma stays with us, and grief is a form of trauma, in my opinion. And so we just don't know that yet. The younger generations are getting it. They're understanding it more. They're talking about it more. In fact, it irritates the Generation X folks. Like, all these people talk about is trauma. I'm like, well, they're starting to understand it while we didn't. So I think it's just a combination, mostly that we just don't really understand how important simply listening and being that empathetic witness to when somebody is suffering. We just don't understand how healing that modality is.
You make a really good point comparing Gen X to Gen Z because when I think about my parents, which they're born in the 60s, what is that, Gen X, boomers? I don't know which generation that is. Early 60s.
I think 60s is boomers. I'm
Boomers, right?
1970s. I'm 1970 and I'm Gen X.
Okay. So yeah, I mean they were born in the 60s. My grandparents, I don't know what year they're born, but they were in their mid 80s at this point. And when I think about especially my dad and his parents, they're not the type to talk about their problems. They're not the type to talk about, especially the men. I mean, you don't talk about your problems, your emotions, your traumatic experiences, crying. Like, man, you better get on with that shit. It's not happening. It's not happening. With my generation, kind of the same. I think that was where we started to transition to being a bit more open about what's going on in our lives, and it's okay to feel your feelings and that type of stuff. And I think what irritates my dad's generation and my grandparents is it seems like we've almost done an overcorrection to where now every single thing that happens to you is traumatic. Every
Right.
single thing that happens to you is a reason to go see a therapist or get on some antidepressants, and they're just like, that's why I think they have a hard time taking it seriously because it's like when I was a kid, we did this, we lived like that, we dealt with this, and there's just this huge disconnect because everybody, like you said, goes through traumatic stuff.
Yep.
And I never thought about it that way, but I definitely have to agree is we don't really know what to do with our trauma, or a lot of people, not only that, in American society, are just alone. So
Yes.
year after year, decade after decade, we've been losing our values. We've been losing the importance of family. People aren't religious like they used to be. They're not talking to their parents. They don't have any extended family that they can rely on. They talk to their friends via a screen, a cell phone screen, maybe with some emojis to express their feelings. So it's just like bottling all of this stuff up, walking around distracted, lonely, and not really knowing how to process my feelings, and then continue down the path that is life, making money, finding a partner, spending time with friends. I mean, all these things. It's rough. It's really rough.
It can be. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you found your therapist almost, I guess we can say by accident. It was a friend that recommended this person to you. And that was the first time that you did, let's say, real therapy that you can remember clearly as an adult.
Right.
Now, up to that point, you didn't think that there was necessarily, I'm talking like, let's say 20 up to that point. You never had this conscious thought like something's wrong. I need to see somebody. Did you try to self-medicate in the way that your mother did? Like, how are you dealing with all this stress and these negative feelings during that time?
You know, what's interesting, and I tell people this, there was actually a video, and someone said, "What if your entire personality is a trauma response?" And it hit me because it's fundamentally how I lived my life. I had a lot of joy and a lot of love in this long term relationship, and my work ethic, my extreme anxiety, my people pleasing were all symptoms of my childhood that I did not know were symptoms. I simply thought that's how I am because I was like that from a very early age. Succeeding academically was one of the only positive reinforcers in my life. So it made sense that the behaviors, studying hard, working hard, being focused, going over the top to achieve, would just continue in my career. It has worked to my advantage. It's one of those protectors I talked about earlier. I've done very well career wise, but it came from a base of trauma versus a base of joy of, oh, I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. No, I was doing what I was doing so that I would have a job and stay safe and be able to create safety nets. So my trauma, I really thought for most of my life was my personality. And healing, one one of the things I was actually concerned about when I was going through this therapy was if I get healed and I don't have this anxiety, is like my work ethic going to go away? Is my
Mm,
career going to go away? Like I really didn't know who Jill was without the trauma. And what I
wow.
learned, and so I can put everybody's mind to ease when this therapy becomes available and if they choose to do it, is that your fundamental personality doesn't go away. The reason and the fear that influences a lot of that behavior, that's what goes away. So now when I work really hard or I'm in the flow at the computer and I suddenly realize it's been 4 hours, it's because I want to be doing that work versus I'm afraid if I don't do it, something bad will happen. Does that make sense? I
Makes
hope that.
perfect sense. Perfect
Okay.
sense. But so you're that line, like what if your personality is just a trauma response? That's like
Is
shit,
that
really makes you stop and
brutal?
rethink your whole life. You know what I'm saying? It's like, damn,
I think I
maybe it
put the
is.
phone down. I think that was an Instagram post. I think I put the phone down, had to think about that for a while.
Yeah, man. Yeah. It's one of those that slaps you in the face. You're like, hold up, you know? But do you
Wait a
like so
minute.
the working hard thing, the intensely focused on your career, you're saying that it was really just like I need to take care of myself. I got bills to pay, I need to eat food and stuff like that. But do you ever have you ever thought that on some level it was you trying to prove either to yourself or one or both of your parents that you were in fact good enough, that you weren't a piece of shit, that you are somebody that's worth looking up to and worthy of love and that you're gonna be somebody in this world, or that never crossed your mind?
No, I never felt that's a really interesting question. I did not respect my parents enough to have to prove
Mm.
myself to them. I mean, I know that might sound harsh. I mean, I might be a little bit of a mic drop, but the same way I don't take criticism from people I don't respect. Uh, yeah, like it wasn't one of the sad things about my parents is that I don't think my parents understood joy. And so for me, succeeding in my career and helping people, I'm like mission driven to kind of help people at heart. It's one of the reasons I advocate for this therapy. Like that's kind of like that's what gets me revved up when other people have the light bulb go on or something. I do something great that helps somebody else. So that's where a lot of the feedback came from. Helping somebody else do something was way important. Like as a teacher, or I was a supervisor of technology. I helped teachers in their classrooms all the time. Like that was way better and way more important than the opinion of two people who, in my opinion, really were not living life very well. So I hope that helps somebody else out there.
Well, no, I'm sure it will. I'm positive it will. That's why I wanted to talk to you because it's like stories like these we don't necessarily hear all the time from regular people, let's say, but I'm sure tons of people out there are dealing with shit just like this and feel like nobody would ever understand them. Nobody's going to listen to what they have to say. There are
Mhm.
people all over the place who haven't gone through the exact same thing, but
But
at the
similar.
same time know what you feel like and have been in your position.
Absolute trauma is trauma. There is no hierarchy.
Exactly.
Anything can be traumatized. You know, you have a beautiful childhood, but mom treats you badly at an award ceremony or something. That's traumatic. There is no hierarchy. So anybody, like for a lot of years, I was like, hey, I was clothed, I was housed. You know, I did get an education. You know, there's other people that went through the foster program and lost family. Like I always kind of played down that other people had it way worse. And I've learned that really isn't the case when it comes to trauma. Anything can be traumatizing to anyone, and it needs to be validated for folks. Stop comparing yourself to other people. That's not the way the human psyche works.
100%. Yeah, I was listening to a podcast a couple weeks ago, and this guy said something like, the worst thing that's ever happened to you is exactly that. The worst thing that's ever happened to you. For some people, it's like they didn't put enough cream on my latte, and that's literally the worst thing that they've ever experienced. For other people, it's my father beat me, or I lost all my money and my career and my family, or whatever it is. But you can't really compare your life and your trauma to somebody else's, as you just said. And so we often do that. We look at people who haven't been through as much as we have. And we're like, man, stop bitching, shut up. You don't know half the shit I've been through. You don't know what me and my family or these people. There's kids in
Right.
Africa. Start, you know what I'm saying? We hear that since like, little kids. We hear stuff like that. And
Yeah.
although I guess you could argue that it's true factually in some cases. I think we use it a lot of times in a dismissive way to say
Yeah.
that your trauma can't match mine, therefore you don't have the right to be sad. You don't have the right to feel pain. You don't have the right to express your feelings. And I think that's very damaging. It's almost an evil thing to say to a kid, to teach a kid your feelings don't matter. Whatever
Yeah.
you're going through is nowhere near as bad as what other people are going through. And then you almost train the kid to just take abuse and to take all of this negative stuff happening to them and just shut up and deal with it. And that's why people are walking around with so much shit on their minds and their hearts and they don't know what to do with it. And then it affects everybody in their lives and they're sad and then everybody else gets sad and it's hard to maintain relationships. It's not good on any level.
Yeah. It's one of those we just don't understand trauma.
Yeah.
Once we start to understand trauma more, we'll understand that there is no hierarchy. And I love that line. What the worst thing that has happened to you is the worst thing that has happened to you. I think
Yeah.
that's a brilliant way of saying it.
Now, who, if anybody, were you looking up to and respecting as you were forming or becoming a young woman? Because a lot of times we need somebody as an example. I want to be like this person or that person, or at least we like to think that way. But I see you shaking your head like maybe nobody's coming to mind. It was just all you.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was my success in school. It was the positive reinforcement from teachers that I knew. Yeah, no, I didn't have the women in my life. The women in my family were not treated very well. The men in my family were. I grew up Jewish.
Hmm.
It was very patriarchal. There was a lot of deference given to men that they didn't, quite frankly, deserve. um, no, I there was just something fundamental in me that knew that life didn't have to be the way that it was. Again, I didn't know what it could be, and I was greatly intimidated by everybody else and like what a normal life would be. I was just very much aware that my life was not normal, and I wanted to get to a point in my adult life where I had normal problems. That was one of the
Hmm.
running things in my head. I just want normal problems.
Wow.
I don't want these problems. I want normal whatever. I don't know what normal problems were. I just knew I wanted them versus what I was living with.
That's a hell of a thing to say, man. And I know a lot of people listening can relate to that. I just want normal problems.
Yeah.
That's now you went to Syracuse, I think you said, and you were studying geology at first for like a year and a
No.
half, or you were taking some summer geology classes or something like that. What were you
Yes,
studying?
let's set that record straight real
Okay.
fast. So I originally went to Syracuse for media and PR, and had to drop out
What
because,
is that? BDMPR?
media and PR, like
Oh,
public
media
relations.
and PR. Okay.
Mhm. Communications, I think, was the actual name of the major.
Okay.
And then had to drop out because obviously I was not going to continue to get beaten by my
Yeah.
father, right? And then when I eventually went back, I went back for secondary education because teaching at that time was a very stable career. I love to
Mm.
read, I love to present and chat. I'm sure you can't tell I'm a chatty person. And that was a beautiful career choice. I taught high school English for 10 years. And then I got my master's degree in instructional technology. And then I moved into district office supervisor of technology so that I could help all the teachers in my district incorporate technology into their classrooms. And this was like 2005. Like we were just getting, I know this is going to sound crazy. People are going to be like, oh my gosh, she's old. But like we were just getting computers in our classrooms at
Wow.
that time. And so I know, look at you laugh. I just aged myself. So yeah, that's how my education kind of maneuvered
Oh man.
communications to education to instructional tech.
I don't know. I mean, you don't seem like the type of person to constantly pat yourself on the back, but I just have to say you're a very impressive person. I mean, to know just a little bit of what you've gone through and the way you reacted to all these situations. And it sounds like even if they were traumatic, even if they did have very negative effects on the way you behaved around certain people or in certain social situations, you never really let it get you down. I mean, you went back to school, you chose a career, you found the love of your life. I mean, you're sitting here today, and not only that, but had the self awareness to actually even go to therapy and have some of the stuff dealt with, work through some of that trauma. And now you're sitting here laughing about some very dark stuff as if, you know, I'm not saying that it didn't have an effect on you. What I'm saying is the fact that you've made it this far is impressive because not everybody can say that.
Well, I think I always have to remind folks that you're seeing the highlight reel right now. You're seeing
Fair
someone
enough.
who went through, you're not seeing me the 6 months after Carl passed, where I was like a shadow of myself. You're not seeing me in the middle of that MDMA. I went through 3 MDMA journeys over the course of a year. You're not seeing me halfway through, like 6 months into that therapy, when all I was doing was crying. You're seeing the highlight reel now of someone who has gone through that therapy, healed the PTSD, continues to maintain a relationship with my therapist. I have used psychedelic tourism to understand how different medicines interact with trauma. And
Mm.
as you're experiencing those medicines, you're having additional healing. And so, and this is also my life, for folks like you who are, your mother shot yourself, like that's pretty big stuff. For me, that's my life. And so I think it's always super important for people to, when they're looking at me and I'm talking about this therapy and they're like, well, that can't possibly be true. Look at how you've got all your stuff together and da 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 da. You're seeing the highlight reel, you're seeing the after. I wouldn't be talking to you during the before. So I always just try to keep the perspective on that. But thank you for the compliment. That was delightful.
No, of course, of course. And so we haven't even really touched on it yet. This is something I'm really curious about, which is the actual MDMA therapy, because your friend recommended the therapist. I'm assuming you guys didn't start there. You started with some form of talk therapy, or what was
Right.
that like?
Right. I mean, I went to her for grief.
Okay.
She helped me. I hadn't lost anybody in my life. I did had a very small family, so I had never experienced loss other than like the loss of a pet. And this was devastating. I mean, I was shattered with Carl's passing, and she helped me. She was that empathetic witness. Is really what it comes down to. I paid to have an empathetic witness and someone to give me perspective, and for me to not constantly beat up on myself that I wasn't getting over it faster. Again,
Mm.
Americans not understanding grief. And so when and she always lets me ebb and flow in therapy. I mean, we're not like a every week kind of thing in any way, shape, or form. And even back then we weren't. It was more like, what do you need? Sometimes it was every 2 weeks, sometimes it was every 3 weeks. Like she would let me ebb and flow. And when I hit that PTSD spiral, I think we were in actually one of those flow points because on the surface everything was great. I was actually in a new relationship. The house was good. The job was good. Everything was looked great. But I just spiraled and immediately, I just didn't know what else to do. I basically said, I need to come back in to we need to change the conversation because this is what's going on. And that's when I started to open up about my childhood stuff. She didn't know any of that before that time.
All right, let me make sure I got it straight. So you're going to her first for grief specifically, nothing more, and then you're working through this grief. Time passes, you actually end up in another relationship. You're saying that the house is good, bills are paid, everything's good. And even now, you still don't know what triggered that PTSD spiral. It just out of
Oh, no,
nowhere
no,
just happened, or
oh, no, no, no. No, at the time I was working for Microsoft, and I got recruited from my K-12 job into Microsoft. So I was in big tech, and there was an email that came through about needing to get some certifications, which on the scale of 1 to 10 was a level 1. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want my career going in that particular direction. It was like to get more technical. It's not what I wanted to do. And instead of having that very rational, okay, it's not what you want to do, but it's really no big deal. It's a test. You ace tests all the time. Like, there's no issue here. My brain was like, come on. My body flipped out. What happened was my nervous system was just kind of depleted with the grief and kind of learning how to live again. It was really only 18 months after his passing, and I fully believe the second year after a loss is even worse than the first year.
hmm.
And I saw this email, and it represented to me that I wasn't going to pass these tests. I was going to lose my job. I was never going to be able to get another job. I was going to lose my house. Like, I spiraled into, I'm going to be back in poverty the way that I was as a child. That's what it was. Like, the universe is just going to smack me down. Um, that's what took me back. And I didn't even go back immediately. Like, I had these sensations. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating well. I was asking everybody for verification. My boss was kind of like, Jill, come on, this is no big deal. And it took about 2 or 3 months of feeling awful and scared for me to call my therapist and say, I need to come in. And then it was an additional 2 or 3 months of talk therapy, of starting to unpack, why is your body reacting like this? Why are you getting closer and closer to being suicidal? Why do you feel like there's this race that you're running that you're never going to win? Why do you think the universe is against you? We started kind of tackling those big feelings. Childhood memories would come up, and that's what led to the PTSD diagnosis that I didn't even believe. I was like, "Have you met me? I'm a corporate girl. There's no way I have my childhood is not impact. No, Like, I totally was so completely oblivious to it. The body keeps a score. She gave me homework. She made me read that book, and that's what taught me. Oh my goodness, all this stuff is trauma and PTSD. And PTSD is this sense of hypervigilance. You can't escape. Nothing's going to work out. There is no joy. There is no happiness. And I was becoming increasingly suicidal. I was at the point where if the universe does one more thing, I'm done. I'm out. Clock me out. I'm done. It was like I couldn't see the last 20 years of my life with a beautiful relationship and a beautiful career. Like, it was like my brain just immediately reverted back to when I was a kid and the rugs being pulled out from under me.
Wow.
So,
And
yeah.
all of this, not to say this in a reductive way, but it sounds like all of this was
One
triggered by the test at Microsoft.
one email. One email
What the
sent me off. And that's what happens. Sometimes that was the trigger that made all of these hidden traumas rise to the surface. It can be
wow.
anything. And I think that's important for people. I'm happy to admit that it was one work email that just triggered me and got me on this path.
Now, you said also something very important, which was you were getting increasingly suicidal at one point. And so, are we talking about like literally any inconvenience would be enough to just send you on the spiral and start thinking about, you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and end it? Or are we talking about other traumatic things that were happening after that point that were making you think it's a good time to end it?
So I think it's important to understand that people with child abuse are marinated in abuse and neglect for at least the first 18 years of their life, usually. And so, what that creates is a foundational feeling in us that it's hard to be happy, that something's always around the corner, something's always around to kind of smack you down. The universe is against you, you can't win, you can't get away, all those kind of very childlike feelings that as an adult, well, of course I can get away, I can make plan B's, I can make money. You kind of revert back to that childhood, I can't escape. And that's really what it became for me, that I had plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. I had all the way, I had the entire alphabet planned. Like I had safety nets. I lived below my means my entire life. I had savings. Like none of these awful things were going to happen. But I felt like they were.
Mhm.
I felt like my ruin, my everything I had worked for was just going to be taken away, and I was going to be at rock bottom the way I was as a kid. Like when my father threw me out of the house when I was 10, like it was the middle of winter, I was outside for more than an hour waiting for my mom, no coat, my dad walking out with like an axe to chop wood in front of me. Like that kind of feeling of I just can't escape and life can't get good. And so the feeling of suicide, I luckily never actually did it, but it was very clear to my therapist as I was talking more and more, I'm done. I'm out. I can't take anymore. I'm never going to win. I'm never going to feel safe. Um, I was just ready to give up, is really what it came down to. Because you just can't win. You just don't feel like it's ever going to get better. Life can be, you can set everything up, but if you don't feel safe and you can't feel joy and you can't feel happiness, there's really no reason to stick around. Is the way that I felt.
Right. Now, what was it about your therapist that even made you comfortable opening up about such personal things and sharing so much of your life with her specifically?
Because we had already established the trust bond with the grief work.
So going back to the grief work then, since that was the first experience,
Yeah.
because I mean, of course, you know that you have this problem, you need to talk to a therapist, but obviously there's a bunch of options. And even if you pick one, it's not a guarantee that you're actually going to do the work in therapy and tell them everything you need to tell them and ponder the questions that they ask you. So, was there anything particular about her that made you feel safe enough to even start down that path to actually grieving the loss of your husband?
She is a very bright woman. I remember I remember at one point saying we were getting ready, I think for the first journey, and I think my guide asked me a very similar question. Why do you feel comfortable with us? You know, because set and setting is super important with psychedelic work, and he really wanted to make sure I was very comfortable with, and the adult Jill was very comfortable. And I remember turning to my therapist and I said, "You can keep up." And she just looked at me and I was like, I'm a little smart. I can be a smart ass, and you can keep up. And that's really what it came down to. I needed somebody who could keep pace with me, who could challenge me when I needed to be challenged, who could show me compassion when I needed some compassion, because there's no one that was harder on myself than I was at that time, especially. She proved herself to me as a person who could really handle herself and could handle working with me. And it's okay if that sounds a little snooty, but that's really the truth.
So, you work with her for the grieving period, and then
Mhm.
this email from Microsoft just sent you spiraling out of I'm still blown away by that. It sent you
I know.
spiraling out of control. And then you're talking to your therapist, she's asking you these questions, trying to get to the bottom of why you're feeling these things. And she says, "Hey, you got PTSD." And you're like, "No fucking
No.
way. There is no chance on earth I'm suffering from PTSD." But it sounds
Right.
like eventually you do come around and you read the book Body Keeps the Score. I'm gonna check that one out. And you realize like, oh shit, there might be something to this. So once you finally accept okay, I have PTSD. There's clearly some unresolved trauma that I'm not looking or dealing with, let's say. What is the actual next step? What's the first step of actual MDMA therapy?
Well, after I admitted that I had this particular diagnosis, my therapist sent me over to maps.org, maps.org, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Because what happened was is that she gives me this diagnosis, we're talking about it, and then we continue with our talk therapy. But the talk therapy wasn't helping. And ultimately, she sends me over to MAPS because she's like, look, there's this therapy that approximately three-quarters of the participants who go through this therapy wind up healing their PTSD symptoms. And I initially said no. I really did. I initially said no. The only thing that had got me through life was my brain. I wasn't going to mess with it. Generation X, we had the egg in the frying pan. Thank you, Nancy Reagan. Like I had only done ecstasy once in my life. I had only smoked pot once in my life. Like I was not into drugs per se. And when I finally went over to the MAPS website and looked at the clinical trial data, that was a factor. The fact that I trusted my doctor, my therapist, because she said to me she was in a program and we were going to be working not only with her, but also her mentor in the program, who at the time was a medical doctor. And that's the way the therapy protocol works with MAPS. It's one patient and two people in the room. And he was a medical doctor. I mean, in my mind, I had like two amazingly educated people. And fundamentally, the talk therapy wasn't making things better. I wasn't seeing any improvement. And so, to be candid, it was my trust in her, my trust in the fact that I was getting a medical product. We were following a protocol that was being used on clinical trials. I did do my therapy underground, but we were following those protocols, and a bit of desperation. And that's why I said yes.
When you say underground, it was that because it still hasn't been approved officially by the FDA as
Right.
real therapy.
Right.
Oh, okay.
And MDMA is still illegal. It's a Schedule One drug in the US. So
Right.
a lot of underground work has been happening.
So crazy to think that a substance like that for so long has been illegal when there are so many stories of people overcoming these mental disorders or traumatic experiences by using these drugs and this therapy. And it just makes you wonder why they haven't necessarily legalized it up to this point. Like, what were they waiting for? Why in 2024?
Let's cross. Well, so the MAPS organization started these trials. Basically, Rick Doblin said there was a lot of research. So Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind does a beautiful job talking about the history of the research that was going on with psychedelics in like the 50s and the 60s, and then the war on drugs and how everything kind of clamped down and research got really abruptly stopped. And then Rick Dobbs, who runs maps.org, he basically said, look, MDMA can work beautifully for PTSD, especially with our veterans population. Let me go the federal approval route. And that's basically what he did. He got enough money to start these clinical trials. By 2017, the FDA, our Federal Drug Administration, basically labeled this therapy as the breakthrough designation in 2017, which means that they recognized there was no other drug on the market that was having the impact that MDMA was having. And breakthrough designation means that it's usually a little bit more of a fast track to drug approval. This is back in 2017. We're at 2024 at this point, and we are super close. Look at me looking at get my little blurry eyes here. August 7th. In the US, the FDA on the 11th is supposed to issue some sort of response as to whether they approve MDMA
Oh, wow.
for PTSD. And in the last 2 months have been a little staticky, a little rocky. And if they do, the DEA, our drug enforcement agency, is then going to have to reschedule
Mm.
MDMA. It'll probably go, a lot of the talk has said it'll go to like a Schedule 3 so that clinicians are able to use it. It'll probably still stay a Schedule 1 for like the rest of us, but clinicians will be able to use it. Um, but we're hoping, I mean, we're talking like August 11th is when the first decision comes down.
Do you know if there was another drug that they would give to PTSD patients before the whole MDMA thing started getting experimented with? Was this another narcotic, or was it purely talk therapy for every patient?
I think a lot of this is a guess because I wasn't. I think a lot of PTSD folks are probably using antidepressant medication in
Mm,
some way, shape, or form to try to dull some of the emotions. That's a guess. We have a pretty high suicide rate within our veterans groups. That's what's kind of tracked. I imagine we also have a pretty decent suicide rate with folks who are like my mother, who were abused and just trying to escape. Um, on average, there's a guesstimate out there that like 5%, 5 to 6% of the American population is suffering with PTSD. So that's millions of people. So this therapy could really help a whole lot of people from a whole bunch of different backgrounds.
100%. Yeah. So, getting back to the actual therapy, because we've got to the point where you're accepting, okay, I trust these doctors. They have my best interest at heart. The research backs up what they're saying. I'm gonna go ahead on this journey. So I think I remember you saying something like the therapy is broken into three parts. So can you break down the three stages of the actual therapy?
It is. So if you think about this therapy as a medical procedure, it makes a whole lot more sense because as soon as people hear psychedelic, like I'll get a wink, wink, like, oh, that must have been a fun therapy. Like, no,
Right.
it was not fun, trust me. But when you think of each therapeutic journey in three parts, the preparation, same way if you're going in for surgery, how you might have to prepare, you might have to lose a few pounds, you might have to eat differently for a week or two, you definitely have to do your research, got to prepare. For me, it was 4 months of talk therapy from the time I agreed to the therapy to the first actual procedure day. The procedure, or like a surgical procedure, takes a whole day. A day with MDMA therapy takes, on average, 5 to 8 hours. That's how long that a patient can be in an enhanced state. And so it's that amount of time with a patient and two doctors. So it's a pretty hefty time commitment, but the same way that a surgical procedure is a pretty hefty time commitment. And then when you get out of surgery, you've got some healing time, you might have some physical therapy, you usually have some sort of post-op set of instructions. With MDMA therapy, the post-op or the instructions afterwards are all about integration. It's about when those memories come up, take the time to look at them, to reframe them, to look at them from an adult perspective. It's the you're living life and things that normally would trigger you. Pay attention to that trigger. Where's it coming from? Start to understand why you're responding and what it's related to back in your childhood. And so I went through that three-stage process 3 times over the course of a year.
Three times. So, what exactly is happening during those 4 months, though? I mean, 4 months of talk therapy just to prepare for the actual journey. What are you guys doing during these 4 months? What are you talking about?
You know, I went on a psychedelic tourism retreat and I saw people very disappointed with their results because they were going into this retreat of like, I just want to change my life. With psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, in my experience, things move along much faster if you do a good bit of the therapy work beforehand. Okay, you want to change your life. Why? What's going on in your life that you want to change? What's making you want to change your life? And that starts to lead you into conversations. Well, I'm not happy here. My body is upset there. I responded in a really weird over here. This is what I want to start healing. Like we narrowed down, I say it now, it's just so natural. It was fear. But at the time, I didn't really understand why I was having that PTSD reaction. I didn't understand why I was so scared. I had had a really successful, knock on wood, adult life. Why was I so scared? And it took 4 months. Remember, too, I was new to drugs. I had every
Hmm.
single question. Am I going to throw up? Uh, what's it going to be like? I mean, I had every single question. And the 4 months were to really make sure I was not only comfortable as much as possible with the procedure before knowing what it would actually be like, but also digging deep into what are we really going to work on. And for
Mm.
me, it was fear.
It's very interesting to know because when I think about psychedelic journeys, especially if it's some kind of healing based work, you're going on some retreat or something of that nature, that's what I imagine is I'm just gonna pop the tab or take the pill or whatever it is, go on this journey and come out the other end a better person. But what I'm hearing from you is it really takes a lot of time to set proper intentions and expectations of what you want to get out of this therapy because that's going to determine what the actual experience is like as opposed to what people imagine when they hear MDMA that you're just taking some drugs and just tripping for a few hours and then you feel better about yourself.
Wouldn't it be nice if it was that easy?
It would be.
I mean, don't get me wrong, talk therapy is the horse and buggy on the country road, and MDMA therapy is the zippy sports car on the highway. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely a difference in speed, but you still need to drive the car and you still need to pay attention to the highway and you need to brake when you need to brake. Like, there's still an intentionality to it. In my opinion, you'll get much further if you really put some thought into why you're doing it and what you want to achieve. An interesting part is that when you're actually in the enhanced state, it might actually seem like nothing you talk about or nothing you feel is related to your intention. 98% of the healing work with MDMA comes after the actual session. It's the integration time that is the most magical, quote unquote, time, in that you have those emotions, you have those memories, you're doing the reframing, you're reimagining your life. Things don't have to be the way that they were. That's where the healing really takes the same way after a surgical procedure. The healing really takes place afterward.
Very surprising. Um, but when you put it in the context or like use the analogy of surgery, it does make perfect sense. It makes perfect
Yes.
sense. But like, let's go to the actual day where you're going to take the MDMA. You're going on this journey with these two professionals. Like, I
Yep.
mean, especially the first time, I got to imagine you're walking into a room. What does it look like? How are you feeling? Like, are you getting butterflies? Do you feel at peace? Like, talk me through the first time that you ever did this.
Overachieving Jill was very concerned she would not overachieve.
Mm.
Yes, I was very nervous. Yes, there's no reason to not admit that I was very nervous. I wanted the therapy to work really badly. I mean, I really wanted it to work. I doubted. I still had, even though I had a basic understanding of trauma, I still had a negative self image of my brain in that I wasn't smart enough to get over my parents' stuff. Like, I had a lot of judgment, I had a lot of shame going on. Um, that day, so the mindset, the 4 months of preparation, that is your mindset, what you're going into the journey about. The setting is the environment. So, whenever people talk about psychedelics, they say set and setting. The setting in my instance was a beautiful journey room. The doctor had owned another little house, and this house was beautifully decorated, and there were multiple seating areas, and there were beautiful art, and there was a mattress. And people always like, well, why is there a mattress? And look at me, and I'm like, well, because when you're in an enhanced state, sometimes you want to lay down. Sometimes you might actually have some trauma that you need to act out. Sometimes MDMA can be very a somatic experience. So there's a mattress, three seating areas, one place where we talked about intentions, another place where we just kind of chatted, another place where we kind of got after the experience, kind of had some snacks and hydrated and things of that sort. It was, I describe it in my book as, it was a cup of hot chocolate on a snowy day, like coming into
Mm.
a house, and the chocolate chip cookies are baking and there's hot chocolate because you just got done with the snowman. Like, it was that kind of warm feeling. um, my doctors really made it a very inviting space. We talked for about half an hour just to reinforce intentions. I took the medication. About an hour in, I had the booster. That's the way that MDMA works. On a therapeutic level, you have a basic dose, and then if you want to have a booster, you have a booster. And at that point, I started talking for the first time in my life about how petrified I was of my father, that if he was in the room, I was sure he was going to try to kill me. And my body wasn't flipping out while I explained some of my childhood memories of him. And I had two people being empathetic witnesses and not poo pooing me. Oh, he's your father. He would never do that. Oh, I'm sure it isn't that bad. Oh, I'm sure you just remember it wrong. I had two people just acknowledging the fear and kind of talking through it, and only really pushing back talk therapy wise if I said something dangerous. I shouldn't have been born. I really don't belong here. I don't know why there's a reason to go on. Those were really the only times that they kind of, had a little bit of talk therapy, but 90% of the time was self directed when I wanted to talk or when I wanted to put my eye mask on and just kind of relax with the medicine. And that's pretty much how the day went.
Wow. So this whole time, they're not necessarily asking you a bunch of questions. They're not asking you to talk about things in particular. They give you the medication, and you essentially you're not by yourself because they're there in the room, but this is your journey to take, and you're processing these memories and just commenting on them. And they're, I don't know, taking notes or trying to guide you, keep you on a positive path, that kind of thing.
Yeah, not only do they take notes, which I found that I've sat with people is very helpful because a lot of stuff comes up without context, and you can't necessarily ask somebody in an enhanced state for context sometimes. So you take notes to kind of keep track because a lot of times MDMA journeys will be circular. People will kind of come back to issues. Uh,
Mm.
and that's definitely how I was. We voice recorded, and I recommend this for anybody that if you have a facilitator that isn't willing to don't video record, the file will be too big. Do a voice recording that should question the person's ethics. We voice recorded. We had a little bit of a tech glitch on the second one, but that's okay. And I got to listen the next day to the journey, and I was
Wow.
amazed at what my subconscious, like, I was just amazed that some of these things were coming out of my mouth. I was like, do I really feel that way about myself? So yeah, it was fascinating.
It sounds fascinating. Yeah, because we're talking about 5 to 8 hours of a journey or this experience. So it's just, I don't
That you
know.
won't remember. You'll only remember about 45-ish minutes. So that's why the voice
No
recording
shit.
is invaluable.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. You won't remember it. I even when we got done, I was kind of like, I thought it was a failure because I didn't feel differently. I didn't remember
Mm,
anything. So yeah, voice recording is super important.
that's wild. But as far as physical sensations from the drug, are we talking, as you mentioned, like the warm cup of hot chocolate on a snowy day or something, but when
Yeah.
I think about any type of drug, whether it's weed or something more psychoactive, LSD, shrooms, or whatever, we think about like tripping, seeing trippy visuals,
Oh,
hallucinating, and having things pop into the mind and all that type of stuff, transferring to a different dimension. Are we
yes.
talking about that type of experience with MDMA, or what type of sensations are you feeling, and what are you seeing, if anything, when you close your eyes?
That's a beautiful question. There are people who argue that MDMA shouldn't be classified as a psychedelic because you don't get those classic visuals. When people are taking Molly or ecstasy, which we all hope has a good portion of MDMA and isn't mixed with something else,
Right.
right? They're taking that particular chemical because it increases your interest in social connection. It makes you more empathetic to other people and yourself. It makes you feel good. For a trauma patient, what it does is, and I always put my hands on my shoulders to illustrate this, and you've seen me do this a few times. I think my entire life, my shoulders were tensed up to my ears. Like I lived a very tense life. Again, I thought it was my personality.
Hmm.
MDMA calms the body down. So that fear response that I would have had normally, my father went after my mother at a parent conference once. He, put his arms around her neck, took her out of the chair, was choking her on the ground. I think I was like fifth grade. And I internalized that he could just snap like that kind of, and of course nothing happened to him. Again, this was, 70s.
What
Nothing
the
happened.
fuck?
So like being able to finally kind of talk about those fears with my body not responding, it would be like, think of the most scary thing. Maybe it's heights, or maybe it's talking in front of a group of people, and just imagine how nervous you would be. And then just imagine how calm you are. Like, I love the beach. So, like, if I'm on the beach, I'm nice and calm. That physical response when you're facing your most terrifying thing That's what MDMA gives you. And when you're able to calm your body down and look at that thing, you're like, wait a minute, my father was really a jerk. It wasn't about me. And guess what? If he tried to do that now, you know, my neighbors, my boyfriend, my dad, like I had resources as an adult that I didn't have as a kid. And so you just get to start to see things differently.
Now, is there a particular reason that it is such a long time? I mean, 5 to 8 hours in just one day. Is there a reason it's not 45 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours? Like, why do they need all
Oh,
day?
it's just the way the chemical works. My first journey was 5 hours. My second and third journeys were about 7 hours because I was more comfortable. Um, One
Wow.
of the things that drug companies are working on, there's a lot of research, independent research. I would love if, we could get it down to 1 or 2 hours. Insurance companies would love that. Like if you could have the
Mm.
same healing result, but only have an hour or two journey, I would be phenomenal in terms of cost savings. It's just, I don't have a, it's just how the medicine works right now.
So from start to finish, those whole 5 hours, you're feeling all the effects of the MDMA?
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild.
And
So you,
I jumped out of it at hour 5 because my inner children, like, they had enough. Like I shut the journey down at hour 5.
no shit.
But once I understood how the therapy worked, my second 2 journeys, I milked them for everything I could get, like solid 7 hours.
But when you say you shut it down, like you were going through the experience and you're just like, okay, I've had enough, and you just take off the face mask, and but are you still feeling the effects of the MDMA at that point?
I was almost instantly awake. I was like, instead of gradually kind of coming back to myself,
Right.
it was like a light switch, and it was a signal. And I remember my guide saying to my therapist, "This is a signal. She has a lot of parts work to do. Um, this is a signal of somebody whose subconscious is still very, very guarded." And it, it,
Mm.
it it might sound harsh, or like, "Oh my gosh, they said that in front of the patient." No, no, no. I was asking a ton of questions. I was asking a ton of questions. There wasn't anything inappropriate with that commentary. So that can happen. The first journey for trauma patients is very often, is this safe? They actually used the analogy with me. They're like, we knew there was a party. You invited us to the party, but when we showed up to the party, you didn't let us in the house. And I was like, oh, that makes
Mm.
sense. But if you think about it, as a little girl, there were no adults that really helped. There were people who knew, but there were no adults that helped. And so here I am in this situation where my inner children, my subconscious is wide open. I need to test if these two adults can be trusted.
Wow.
This was happening with me in my first journey.
That's deep, bro. Yeah, and that's something when you were telling that those stories about your childhood. That's why I asked, like, did you ever think maybe call the police or get a weapon or something? Because I'm like, how is everybody just sitting around watching this happening? Like, what the hell is going on here? And
Yeah.
so what you're saying makes a lot of sense. It's just so surprising to think. But the more I listen to you talk, the more I can imagine you just being like, all right, let's shut this shit down. I need a break. I need, I've had enough for the day. You know
Yep.
what I mean?
That's what it was.
It's
That's what it was.
very, very okay. So you snap out of it and you're like, okay, I've had enough. The session is done for today. And then comes the actual healing process, which I believe you said is like 98%. And you refer to it as integration. Now, there was something that you said before we get to that. You mentioned something called parts work. Can you explain what that is?
Going back to that IFS, Internal Family Systems, Dr. Richard Schwartz, it's his, uh, boy, I wish I knew better vocabulary. It's his way of doing therapy, which is a beautiful way of using your imagination. That parts work means I had a lot of protectors. Uh, in some ways, I actually had, in therapeutic terms, I had an avatar. Like I had the front facing Jill that everybody saw, competent, get stuff done, very positive, very friendly, to make sure that she didn't create any sort of conflict, to keep everything safe. that avatar, that front facing Jill, or that part, or that actor was hiding the very scared Jill that thought any sort of confrontation would ultimately lead to the kind of anger that she experienced from
Mm,
her father as a child. So when my doctor said she's got a lot of parts work, I had a lot of protective strategies that that I needed as an adult to survive. Is really what it comes down to. But using parts work is a beautiful way of using your imagination to kind of talk to your inner children, to do a lot of reparenting. I don't shy away from the idea that we have it we have an opportunity, if a therapist allows for the imagination to come through for healing, versus just pure linear just talk therapy. As soon as you start to add your imagination in, and start to picture these parts and wanting to talk to them, and picturing yourself when you were 10 and actually talking to yourself when you're 10, when you start to use your imagination to heal, it can really speed things up. And I did not understand any of that before this therapy.
I see here a quick explanation might be parts work is an umbrella term for therapy approaches that aim to identify and resolve conflicts between different parts of the self. And then it
Yeah.
mentions IFS. So I'm definitely going to check out more of that later. But what you're saying is very interesting, especially the part about using your imagination in therapy, talking to different parts of yourself. Because I gotta believe there's somebody listening that's like, this
That's
lady
weird.
sounds fucking crazy. Exactly, exactly. You're talking to different parts of yourself, and I think it's unfortunate that for whatever reason, mental health in general is grossly misunderstood. But the way that traumatic experiences affect us, and also like how our personalities can kind of be compartmentalized, how we develop these coping mechanisms or these ways of being or talking or processing emotions for specific situations in life, for specific kinds of people in life. And you might even think, I'm being fake, or maybe I am going crazy, or something, I have some type of disorder. But as you just said, maybe it's just all a reaction of some traumatic shit that you went through as a kid, and you
Yeah.
needed to find a way to protect yourself when nobody else would.
It's a survival strategy. And for folks who are interested in IFS, Dr. Schwartz is incredibly generous. Do a YouTube search. You can find some great information. I first learned about it. Uh, I think it was definitely before my first journey. It was a Tim Ferriss interview with Dr. Schwartz, and I remember I was loading the dishwasher and I was kind of following along with the meditation, and the same part where Tim hit a childhood memory. I hit a childhood memory, and I'm sitting there. I'm standing there crying as I'm loading the dishwasher because this IFS meditation was so powerful. He's incredibly generous. There's a lot of meditations, a lot of explanations online, so I always encourage people to go take a look.
And the internet is just incredible, isn't it? To think that 40 years ago, you could never find something like that. All the information, the resources, the professionals, people like yourself sharing their story generously with other people who might be in the same position. It's such an incredible time, despite all the crazy stuff that's happening in the world. It's still an incredible time to be alive, man, because you just didn't have access to stuff like that. Like you said, Gen X, boomers, or anybody before them, just walking around with pain and shame and trauma and frustration and anger and hatred and have no idea what to do with it. It was just suck it up and just deal with it because that's what you're supposed to do.
Beautiful
Yeah.
summary. Yes.
So
Yeah.
the integration, I almost forgot. This is part three of the three-part process. Now, what exactly does integration look like? What does that mean? I have to assume it's integrating the experience that you had into your new life, quote unquote, if we can say it that way.
You got it. You got
Mm,
it. So I walked out of the therapy room, the journey space, and I was disappointed because I thought I'd feel different. Like I really did not. You walk out of surgery, you had surgery. You walk out of an MDMA session, you're kind of like, okay, what happened? Because again,
mm,
you don't really remember much. So I start getting into this shame spiral. My boyfriend comes and picks me up, and I'm sitting in the car with him. And this was all of like a half an hour from where I lived. So this was not a big deal. This was like, on a weekend, not a big deal to pick me up. But I'm in this shame spiral that It didn't work. I didn't do a good enough job. I'm not smart enough. I'm such an inconvenience. I wasted these two people's time because
Wow.
even though the journey was only 5 hours, we were probably together for like a solid 7 hours by the time, you sit down and da da da. And, and that, they didn't let me leave unless I was totally sober, which is appropriate. So that takes time. And I'm in the car and I'm looking out the window and I'm crying. I'm going through this shame spiral. And I had three childhood memories pop up from after my mother had shot herself when I was being shunted around to different relatives. It was just very clear that I didn't have a space. I didn't have a family. I was an inconvenience. I was the extra cot in the room. I was the hand me down clothes. Um, and I was, 6 months here, 6 months here, 3 months here. I was being shuffled around. So I was an inconvenience. So I get these memories pop up and I'm looking at them. It was almost like, when you're in the shower and you have an idea kind of pop into your head. Like that's how it was. And I'm just kind of thinking about them and I'm realizing, wait a minute, I wasn't an inconvenience. My parents couldn't take care of me. My mother was recuperating from a shotgun wound, for goodness sake. I have no idea why I wasn't living with my father. I don't understand that. I have a funny feeling it was just that he was incapable of caring for another person, but that's a whole other. But long story short, I was with different relatives and it developed in me this feeling of, again, I was a child. There's something wrong with me. I don't deserve to have a family. I'm an inconvenience to everyone. And when I shifted it and said, no, it wasn't that I was an inconvenience. I was a kid that needed caring for. Wait a minute, maybe I'm not always an inconvenience. I remember turning to my boyfriend and I said, I think I know how this therapy works. And it was like that. I mean, especially the first week or two after the journey for me, my memories were on fire. I'm not a big meditator. I like to have activity. And so I would walk my dog, and every dog walking, it was like talking to my inner voice, having these memories come up, reframing them, going home, journaling, writing them down, because you'll be amazed. You'll have a shift and you'll forget that you even thought a certain way. And I remember saying to my therapist, like, this is amazing how quickly this can happen. Like I sometimes don't even remember unless I get home and journal it. And she was like, well, yeah, does a butterfly remember what it was like to be a caterpillar? I was like, ooh. So that was pretty much the process. And I knew we were ready for another one. My first journey was September. My second journey wasn't until December. The clinical trials did them 1 month, which is fine. My doctors just kind of let me work at my own pace. And so I could tell I'm reframing, I'm reframing, I'm reframing. I'm no longer reframing. I'm kind of scared. I'm kind of scared. I'm kind of scared. That's when I knew I was ready for another one, when I was no longer
Mm.
reframing and I still had that fear. I just talked a lot at you. What questions have I
No,
created?
no, no. You talked a lot to me. I'm taking it all in. Don't worry. I'm taking it
Okay.
all in. I'm
So
trying
there's a
to
lot.
put myself in the trying to imagine what that must be like because you're saying that you lead this journey room, I guess you can call it that. You leave the therapy, you have this journey,
Yeah.
and then for the next few months, it's kind of just like, okay, I'm living my life as if nothing happened. You going through, it's so incredible, like to hear the way your mind works. You're thinking, I did something wrong. I wasted these people's time. Like, did that even happen? Did that even work? And then a few more days pass or a couple weeks pass, and then all these things start flooding into your consciousness and you know that you went through that experience, so it's not like, why is this happening? You had some idea that this was going to happen, but still having to just live your normal life as if, well, not as if nothing happened, but go on with your life, even having these memories and still having to process them. So I have to
Mhm.
imagine you were in contact with your therapist during this time as well, relaying these memories or these epiphanies that you had and stuff like that too, right?
The journal really helped. They were the first the first day after the journey, a little bit of an MDMA hangover. I hadn't been taking any supplements at the time, so I definitely lazed around. It was like a soup and hot chocolate kind of day. Um,
Mm.
but I would say the day after is when the reframes really hit. I always kind of said it was like having like a beautiful fire outside, really crackling, a lot of stuff going on. And then as a fire kind of dies down, that's how kind of like as the days and the weeks go on, like the fire kind of dies down, and you
Mm-hmm.
kind of stop having the warmth at that point, or you stop having the reframes.
I see.
You're ready for another one.
But when you say reframe, are they teaching you how to look at these memories differently? Is that what reframing actually means?
You don't need as much. That's exactly what it means. And sometimes you might need a therapist to really help you with a major reframe or help you talk through some stuff. But I will say that in the very beginning, I was doing the reframes. Think of it like if you had a friend talking to you saying, "I just don't feel good enough. My dad beat me when I was a kid." What would you say to that friend? That had nothing to do with you. He was a jerk. It's very easy for you to do it for other people. For yourself, it's really hard. The MDMA almost puts your memories like on a TV screen or like there's
Mm-hmm.
distance from the memories because your body is much calmer when you're looking at these memories, and it's basically looking at them now through your adult perspective. And my adult perspective says that little toddler didn't deserve to be beaten. My mother probably would not have shot herself if my father hadn't left a loaded shotgun in the bedroom. Like you start to reframe and start to understand your memories in a different way.
Wow. So do we know why it is that after a certain point in time, that level of comfort and that ability to process these memories differently just slowly fades, and then you have to go through the journey again? Like, why isn't it just one time? Do we know that already?
Well, so I named the book "Healing My PTSD" because at the end of the three journeys, I no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis, but I definitely have continued to work on trauma. So for a lot of people who maybe weren't marinated in abuse, maybe just had something traumatic happen, or they had one attack or something of that sort, one MDMA journey can absolutely help folks in that situation. I just had 19 years of a childhood of abuse, and as an adult, an ingrained fear of my father. Some would argue that I had complex PTSD to a certain extent, and that just takes more time. A lot of time, think about cleaning. I use all the time the idea of like a sink of dirty dishes, and the dishes are the memories, and the trauma is like the dried up food and gunk on the plates. And sometimes you take a little bit of dish soap and you start doing the dishes, but you find that the crud is still there and you need more
Mm,
dish soap. So you might need 2 or 3 squirts of dish soap over the time to really clean like a really nasty pan.
interesting.
That's the analogy I use. Sometimes you just need more medicine to cut through the years of trauma. And there
Yeah,
should be
yeah.
zero judgment for folks. It doesn't matter how many MDMA journeys it takes. There's no, oh, you needed more than three, or oh, you needed less than there's no bragging rights here. You do as many as you need to do.
That's another interesting thing because again, we you highlighted that the effects of MDMA are nothing like the at least stereotypical effects of shrooms or LSD or some other psychedelic. So
Right.
is there a such thing? You kind of already said it, but is there a point where it's like, okay, 10 journeys that you've been on, 15 journeys, it's like, is that going to have some kind of effect on the way you process life in general at some point? Or it really doesn't matter how many times you do it, you're always going to be Jill.
Right. Foundationally, and what I'll say too is that MDMA works beautifully when your system is dysregulated. One of the reasons why it works so well for PTSD is that it calms the body down. Uh,
Uh-huh.
I'm not seeing any research right now that like somebody needs 10 of them. What I'm seeing more of is you needed to calm the body down. You needed two, three, four of them. And then people like me have moved on to other medications. So, like 8 months after that third MDMA journey, I went back to my doctors and said, "Look, I'm not suicidal. I feel a little off. I've still got some of this fear stuff that comes up. I know the universe isn't out to get me. I just still kind of have this fear." They chose for me a psilocybin journey at that point because I didn't need an MDMA journey. My system was not dysregulated. I just needed to work through some more stuff. And so that's what I find happens, that you kind of move through different medicines as you move through your healing. Not that MDMA wouldn't have helped in that instance, but my system my system didn't need that particular medicine at that time. Does that make did I explain that well?
100%. Yeah,
Okay.
crystal clear.
Okay.
And I guess what I have to imagine is a lot of the critics of this type of therapy, whether it is psilocybin or magic mushrooms or MDMA, I got to imagine the critics would use an anecdote like that and say, see, this is the reason we can't legalize this, or we have to be very careful because she started with MDMA, now she's going to shrooms, next it's going to be LSD. It's like clearly the MDMA thing isn't working. I mean, you have to imagine somebody would use that as an argument or a reason why they would never try this because they hear, well, I thought the MDMA thing was supposed to treat it. Why is she now taking shrooms? Like, what's up with that?
I can totally understand that. And I would say to those folks, you probably don't have a history of child abuse. When you have your foundation was based in cruelty, it takes a long time to unravel that cruelty. If your background was sexual abuse, mine was not, but if your background was sexual abuse, it takes a long time to unravel that. We interestingly don't seem to judge if somebody is in talk therapy for 10 or 20 years.
This is true.
But oh gosh, and we don't judge if one brand of painkiller doesn't help us after a certain period of time and we need another kind of painkiller. But suddenly, because these are Schedule 1 drugs, the fact that I might go to, let me use this as an example. Bufo is a beautiful psychedelic that is very short. It's great for folks who had a very traumatic experience because it jolts the system. I've used it for trauma, had amazing healing with certain memories. Uh, why would I not use that medicine? Why would I not? If I knew that I had some trauma that I need to disrupt, Bufo was fantastic for helping me to get rid of some of my embedded grief. Why would I not use a medicine that can help me move things along? We don't think twice about taking a pain medication. We don't think twice about taking an antidepressant or trying different antidepressants. But suddenly, wait a minute, I might try different psychedelics to deal with different issues. So hopefully that helps those folks who initially had that first thought.
I mean, you said it perfectly, perfectly. And I didn't even think about because you mentioned painkillers or somebody being in talk therapy for 20 years. In my mind, as you said, everybody goes through different stuff. It's not my place to say how long something should take. But if you've
Right?
been talking to the same therapist for 20 years, it's like, is this working? Like, I mean, what's going on here? How much money have you spent on hours after hours after hours of talk therapy?
Right.
And how long do you have to go on before you realize we need to try something else? So, I mean, you said it perfectly. Antidepressants or just straight up alcohol, weed, or some other toxic cigarettes, whatever it may be, whatever people choose to use to numb their pain or deal with their shit. So I think that's a really good point. And I have to imagine, of course, the war on drugs had a major effect on the way the country and really the world sees marijuana, psilocybin, MDMA, and any other drug. And so
Right.
I think that's probably got to be the biggest hurdle people have to get over, which is I'm using some psychedelic or psychoactive thing. I'm gonna be strung out, I'm gonna be addicted, or I'm gonna be a different person. It's gonna alter my personality. And
Right.
I think that's why, or I know that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you because hearing somebody's actual story and what they've been through and how it affected them, I think in a lot of cases it really is what somebody needs to understand. Maybe this is actually an option for me. There's tons of people, as you said, millions dealing with PTSD or other types of trauma or mental disorders or just stress and grief and pain or whatever it is, and it never even considered something like NDMA, never even considered talking to somebody or not
Right.
even knowing that this stuff is available these days. So
Right.
yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about this stuff today because I think the future in that area does seem to be bright, even if it is going to take a bit of time. As
Right.
these things become legalized, as they become normalized, if we can use that word, more and more people will be getting the mental help that they desperately need. I can't speak about the whole world, but in the US, I've always had the impression a lot of people are walking around with mental health issues that just never get treated. And they say, oh, it's just, I'm just stressed out, or oh, it's just this, or oh, it's just that. It's like, no, you have a problem, bro. You need help. And
Yeah.
when you help yourself, you help everybody in your life. Because if you get your shit together and you're happier, more fulfilled, want to help and love other people, it just creates that chain reaction.
Ripple effect. I always kind of mention to folks that Schedule 1 drugs are described as drugs that have no health benefit and a propensity for abuse. Why are cigarettes not Schedule 1 drugs?
Good question.
And when you look at that, why is alcohol not a Schedule 1 drug? And when you realize in the United States, we are not an anti-drug society. We are a who had the biggest lobby behind the drug society.
Yeah.
And suddenly I was like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, I get it now. No one's really going to lobby for magic mushrooms because you can grow them. There's not a lot of money to be made.
Hmm.
So it's just a really interesting, one of the reasons why I have this talk, and I'm so grateful for folks like you to let me have this chat, is that I had all the stereotypes about drugs too. If I hadn't been presented with this therapy and found it so successful, I wouldn't be having this conversation. So I totally get where people are coming from because that's where I was in the very beginning.
Hmm. And speaking of the money, another thing, I think I might have heard you say it in a video or something that I hadn't even considered, which is once it does become FDA approved and you can go to places all over the country and get this treatment,
Yeah.
that is, I think, a net positive for people that actually need the treatment. It's a net positive for the people doing the work. However, if there's money to be made,
Yeah.
there's going to be some bad actors who are just going to try to make as much money as possible. So, how do you see the future from that standpoint, looking at the way that the drug and the therapy might be deceptively marketed to very vulnerable people who need this help?
In my opinion, I think bad actors are going to market it as a turnkey solution.
Mm,
That 3 phase process I talked about, the talk therapy, the procedure, and the integration. I think that's going to get, for some bad actors, I think that's going to get lip service, and people are going to be sold on this can just help me like that, and I'm not going to have to put a lot of work into it. It'll be like the magic diet pill kind of thing. Um, you can easily go through an MDMA journey, and well, first of all, you should absolutely be screened. If you have any sort of history of schizophrenia in your family, you should absolutely avoid psychedelics. I was screened for schizophrenia, for phobias, and for any heart issues because MDMA is a stimulant. That's what I was screened for. So there should be some sort of screening. If there's just like a carte blanche, we'll take anybody, that's a red flag. Secondly, there should be some sort of ongoing support that if the person isn't in a therapeutic relationship and is pursuing MDMA, it should also be a bit of a red flag that you should be encouraged to have some sort of therapeutic relationship, whether it's with the clinical folk, with the people at the clinic who are running it or not, but just kind of drive by, go into a clinic for 8 hours, come out and don't have any ongoing support. That's a red flag. And I think that's going to happen, unfortunately. And it might take a long time for that to happen. If it gets FDA approved in the very beginning, it's going to be very much locked down from everything I'm hearing, which is a good, there's pros and cons to everything. We definitely have to crawl before we walk. So I think in the very beginning, it's going to be expensive because I don't think insurance is going to cover much of it. Um, it's going to be limited because of the production of MDMA and which clinics are going to be able to offer it. So it's not going to be available everywhere. Every state in the US, just because an FDA approves a drug, does not mean states have to approve its use in their states. So it's not
good
even going to be
point.
available everywhere, which I was surprised to learn. So it's the same way that it was. This therapy was legalized in Australia of last year and highly regulated. There haven't been so many patients. I think that's going to happen here. It's going to have kind of a slow start. Again, this is my opinion. My opinion, a dollar bill gets you a cup of coffee. So take that in mind. I have no inside knowledge. I think it's going to be slow. I think initially the marketing is going to be okay. And then once it starts to take off, then you might run into some marketing problems.
Mm, yeah. I think we've seen that during the pandemic with just regular talk therapy, like companies like BetterHelp, and you don't have to leave your home, just do therapy via a Zoom call or something like that. And I'm not saying that giving people access to talk therapy is bad. Obviously, that's not bad. I just think that some of the marketing tactics around stuff like that can be a bit manipulative when you're talking directly to people who are already not in a good mental state and they think, oh, if I just give this person my money and just talk about my problems, then everything will be fine. And I can't remember who said it. I was listening to a podcast episode, but this woman was saying a major cause of depression for a lot of people, anxiety too, is just sitting around and talking about your problems all the time. So sometimes talk therapy can be what would you call it, counterproductive, which is like every single week you're talking to the same person about how this is wrong and that's wrong and everything is horrible. And this person is almost incentivized to just keep letting you go on about how horrible everything is because then you keep showing up and giving them money. Like you're
Oh,
essentially funding their lifestyle because it's not in the, it's, this sounds bad and it's a very blanket statement. I know this isn't true for everybody, but you could argue that for a lot of psychologists or therapists, let's say, they're not really incentivized to help you solve your problems because as soon as they do, that paycheck is gone. So what I'm saying is we have to account for the bad actors in the space who understand that and are just going to go to whatever lengths they can to just make a dollar as opposed to helping people. And I see that from my limited knowledge about this topic, I see that as a major hurdle for legitimizing therapy like this so that people can actually get the help they need, so the people actually giving the help can be seen as a legit resource for helping these people. I would have to imagine that there's going to be a lot of people just giving it a bad name in the early stages. Maybe it'll never stop, but I
that's
guess it
interesting.
just comes with the territory, right? It's part of the process.
I read an article, I think probably last year, about that very same, that it had never occurred to me that there would be a portion of the therapeutic community that might not want a therapy that moves this fast. They're not used to it. And yeah, could you see a decreased patient load? And it was a really interesting article from learning from somebody else's perspective. In my opinion, the millions of people that we have with mental health challenges that aren't even diagnosed, I don't really see a quality therapist not having clients at this
Exactly.
point. Unfortunately, I don't mean to laugh about it, like, but just the idea of I need to protect my paycheck and I need to keep this person. It really doesn't have a worldview of just how many mental health issues there are, at least in the U.S. And
Hun-
I'm really good friends with two clinicians, both of whom have zero empty spots and a wait list. So um,
There you go.
folks
Yeah.
be doing that are definitely not looking at the big picture.
Exactly. I mean, it's such a like a scarcity mindset. I mean, and not only that, I mean, isn't that shouldn't that be the main motivation regardless of the paycheck? Your job is to help these people, solve their problems.
Right.
And just by doing that, they're gonna tell their friends, they're gonna tell their family members, they're gonna tell their coworkers, and then
Well,
they're gonna think, oh, well, maybe I should try it. My sister did it, my husband did it, my friend did it. I'm gonna go do it. It's like I mean, it's just so obvious. So yeah, we're definitely on the same page about that. But
yeah,
what I'm curious about is the difference for you between the MDMA journey and the psilocybin journey, because these are two very different drugs and have very different effects. So
yeah.
what was it that made you choose that? Was it your therapist that recommended psilocybin? Were you doing your own research? Like, how did that come along?
No, I left my treatment up to them. So,
Okay.
and I have learned, because my nervous system was calm, I didn't need, and I wasn't suicide. I wasn't on that PTSD scale. They were able to kind of look at other healing modalities. My third journey was MDMA with a little bit of mushrooms. I had actually run
Hmm.
into a real blocker. Like I had an inner 5-year-old that was trapped in that childhood home where my mother had shot herself. And my doctors actually used a very low dose of magic mushrooms in that third journey. And it just kind of opened up my childhood home. So when I went back to them 8 months later and said, I'm still kind of scared and I don't know where it's coming from. That was really the problem. I couldn't identify why I was still feeling scared. And, they just looked at the symptoms I was experiencing, and they chose psilocybin, which is a bit more of an internal medicine. Um, it actually opens up a bit of spirituality in my case. And they gave me a dose that I was still able to have a conversation at times, but I was also able to let the medicine work, use my eye mask, and see the beautiful visuals and things of that sort. Um, it's just an example of, as my brain healed and kind of moved up the ladder of healing, and just different chemicals were able to facilitate that healing at different times.
Hmm, interesting.
Yeah.
So that the last MDMA experience, do you remember how many milligrams of shrooms was included in that small dose?
It was literally like two. I can't tell you the actual milligrams. It was literally
Uh-huh.
like two little tiny mushrooms, and just from
Okay.
my experience now, it was a very low dose. I didn't
Okay.
need too much.
Okay.
And it's called a hippie flip out in the underground. It's called a hippie flip. It's not an uncommon thing. It was definitely not part of the clinical trials, but my doctors and I mean, my second journey was January. My third journey was May. There was a lot of talk therapy and a lot of work being done, and a lot of blockages. We were dealing with some pretty heavy stuff. So that's when we started using psilocybin. And so I went back to my doctors. I did two psilocybin journeys with my doctors. And then that's when and my doctors moved. They moved out of my area. And so that's when I started going on psychedelic tourism retreats. I was like, what is this about? I was single at the time. I was like, we can do this. And that was my first experience with psilocybin, and then DMT. And DMT is a very spiritual experience. And that made me even more curious about different psychedelics and how they work with trauma. And so I have worked with Bufo, which is a beautiful, beautiful psychedelic for trauma. I've worked with Iboga, which is beautiful for trauma, but also amazing for addiction. I mean, if anybody has an opioid or alcohol addiction, look at the research about ibogaine and iboga. It's just amazing. And so I find it super cute. Now I'm just at a point in my life where I'm just so curious about all the different research. Johns Hopkins doing research about psilocybin and anxiety and end of life anxiety and stopping smoking and stopping alcohol, and iboga with addiction, and bufo with PTSD. Like, I'm just so excited for the next 10 years and all the research that's going to come out to really narrow down which medicine to use when. Uh,
Hmm.
I'm finding it fascinating.
It is. It's really fascinating because, as I said from the beginning, we think about these drugs and we're thinking just tripping, seeing crazy visuals, going to some other dimension or something like that. And I've even met a couple people who have had so many hits of acid or done so many shrooms. It's almost like something is just off, something's different, you know. It's almost like a piece of them is stuck in another dimension, or
Oh,
they've like what I mean is that they've abused these chemicals and these drugs to a certain extent, and they're using them really just recreationally, going to parties and festivals and things like that. It has
sure.
nothing to do with spirituality or healing parts of themselves. It's just, I just want to trip balls. And I
Yes,
think that is what most of us think of when we think of shrooms and LSD and stuff like that. But
sure.
hearing all of these other applications for these drugs is just mind blowing, because when you think this is 2024, this stuff still isn't legalized. How many hundreds, if not thousands of years has this stuff been around and just readily available for people to use and benefit from? And
Right.
it's been under lock and key because Nancy Reagan was like,
Yeah.
just say no. Just say no. This is your brain on drugs type of thing, man. It's crazy. It's
Right.
crazy.
Right. I mean, one of the drug companies just got breakthrough therapy designation for LSD, and I want to say anxiety. Don't quote me on that. I have to get the research. But the fact that our FDA is actually saying LSD is a breakthrough designation drug for a mental health issue. I mean, that's how far we've come. You go look on
Wild.
Gov trials, you type in psychedelic, you get hundreds of clinical trials around psychedelics. So I'm so excited about what the future holds and what the research is going to show us. Because right now the research has been it's been very white, to be candid. It's been
Mm.
very white. It's been in certain parts of the world. Like, I'm really excited as research expands globally and what we're going to learn.
So you mean white like white people specifically?
Yeah,
Ah.
it's been very white. And that's a Jill Sitnick opinion. Don't come after me. But
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
it hasn't been as because it's at the the building block part. It just hasn't been as inclusive yet.
Mm.
I'm super, just to get really personal, I'm super curious about psychedelics and perimenopause and menopause symptoms. The research doesn't exist yet. I can't wait for that to exist. So that's just one example.
Wow. Have you ever considered going from somebody who's experiencing these journeys and these different drugs to heal parts of yourself to actually working in the industry, doing the trials and working with other patients?
So thank you for asking. I am in a Third Waves coaching program. I'm through another coaching program. So I did executive coaching way back in the day. And I was like, you know what? I should go get my certificate because I don't want to be a therapist. Um, so I joined the Third Wave coaching program and I'll get put into their directory because, to be honest with you, with my background and my book and my content, people reach out to me all the time. I've worked with people. I just wanted some paperwork behind me so people like me, corporate girly, would trust who they're working with. And I can totally see, I think in like, I was supposed to be an interior designer or an event planner or something. I could totally see creating retreats to heal people. I have an incredible background in adult learning. I used to teach graduate classes all the time. And so I think I could make some really beautiful healing retreats for folks. So I think that's in my future. I think. We'll see. Not
Wow.
exactly sure, but I think.
Well, fingers crossed for these approvals. As you said, August 11th, I think we're supposed to get some kind of update for the MDMA specifically.
We'll see.
So, yeah, man, I think that your story, I mean, this is just the pieces that we've heard of it. Obviously, there's so much more, but your story is the perfect example of like, of course, there's a lot of things to be sad about, a lot of things to cry about. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of negativity, and even still, even if not for everyone, there's a lot of stuff to smile about too. I mean, there's tons of inspiring stories of overcoming these challenges, bringing other people together, healing relationships, getting in touch with oneself, and you're the perfect example of that. And that's why I wanted to talk to you today. And I really thank you for having this conversation with me. It's been very enlightening.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. And we certainly took a leisurely time getting through all the points. And I think your audience will probably really appreciate, the attention to detail that you brought to this conversation. So I thank you.
Hey, it was a collaborative effort, and I enjoyed every minute. I wish we had a few more hours to get into it, man, because the whole psychedelic stuff is such like a black box for me. I don't know anything about it, so the more I can learn, just the more I want to know. You know what I mean? So, yeah, it's super interesting. But where can people find out more about you in case they want to reach out, learn about you, get in contact? Should people go?
Yeah, I'm thejourneysage.com. That's my website. I've got a bunch of resources for folks. The YouTube channel is the channel at the Journey Sage. That's the content that I wish had been around when I was going through the therapy. When I was going through the therapy, there really wasn't any real content because, it was still clinical trial stuff.
Yeah.
So if you want to understand a therapy a bit more, I would go there. If you are interested in actually the year of healing, the 2 steps forward, the 1 step back, that's the memoir. I will warn folks that if you have a history of child abuse, you get the book. If you don't have a history of child abuse, you're kind of like, this is repetitive. So I just warn people.
Ah.
And I have a workbook. If you're going on a psychedelic retreat or you're thinking about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, I also made a little workbook that duplicates the 8 different ways my therapist and I worked on creating intentions. And that came out of going on that retreat and seeing people really disappointed. So I'm
Wow.
hopeful that can help folks. And you can get the body prompt from that workbook, the one major method my therapist and I use probably more than 50% of the time. That's freely downloadable on my website. And there's a couple of chapters on my book. My goal is, it's the teacher in me. The more curriculum and stuff I can give to folks, the better.
I love it. I love it. And I'll link everything in the description of this episode as well, your website, the YouTube channel, all that type of stuff.
Cool.
But Jill Sitnick, thank you again for the conversation. I know I enjoyed it. I'm sure the listeners will too. And I thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you for
Incredible.
having me. This was
Incredible, of course.
delightful.
Awesome. All right, y'all.